Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is David Jones, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Ouachita National Forest, deep in the Arkansas wilderness where the trees grow so thick they swallow sound itself. I should have known something was wrong when Bear started whimpering 3 miles into the trail. My German Shepherd had never shown fear of anything in his 5 years. Not thunderstorms, not fireworks, not even the neighbor's aggressive pit bull. But there he was, pressed against my leg, trembling like a leaf in a hurricane as we approached the clearing I'd marked on my GPS for our campsite. The divorce papers had been finalized for exactly 2 weeks. 23 days since I'd lost my job at the engineering firm. I needed this. 3 days of nothing but pine trees, mountain air, and the kind of silence that only comes when civilization is 40 miles behind you. Bear and I had done this route before, back when Sarah still pretended to care about my hobbies. The Brushy Creek Trail was supposed to be familiar territory, but something felt different this time. Wrong. The GPS coordinates led us to a narrow valley between 2 ridges, exactly where I remembered the clearing should be. Only the clearing wasn't there anymore. Instead, ancient oaks formed a perfect circle around a patch of ground that looked like it had been burned decades ago. Black earth that nothing would grow on. The smell hit me first. Something sweet and rotting, like fruit left too long in the sun, but underneath it was something else. Something that made my sinuses burn. "Easy, boy," I whispered, but Bear had already backed away from the tree line, hackles raised. I checked my phone. No signal, which was expected out here, but the GPS coordinates kept flickering, jumping between numbers that made no sense. According to the device, we were simultaneously on Brushy Creek Trail and somewhere called Hunger Hollow, a name I'd never seen on any map of the Ouachita Mountains. The rational part of my mind said to keep hiking, find the actual clearing. But the sun was already sinking toward the ridge, and I'd learned the hard way that navigating these mountains in the dark was a good way to end up as a missing person statistic. Besides, the burned circle was level ground, and I'd camped in worse places. I set up my tent while Bear paced nervously around the perimeter, never taking his eyes off the tree line. Every few minutes he'd stop and cock his head like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. When I called him over for dinner, he approached reluctantly, constantly looking over his shoulder. "What's got you spooked, buddy?" I scratched behind his ears, but he flinched away from my touch. Another first. Bear loved attention, especially after a long hike. As I opened a can of beans over my camp stove, the flame kept guttering out despite the complete absence of wind. Each time I relit it, the flame burned a slightly different color. First the normal blue, then tinged with green, then an unsettling purple that cast weird shadows on the surrounding trees. By the time I'd managed to heat my dinner, my hands were shaking. Bear refused to eat. He just sat at the edge of our camp, staring into the forest with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I followed his gaze but saw nothing except the deepening shadows between the trees. As darkness fell, those shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, flowing like liquid across the forest floor. I should have been exhausted. We'd hiked nearly 12 miles, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard things. Branches breaking in a rhythm too regular to be natural. Something large moving through the underbrush just beyond the reach of my flashlight. And underneath it all, a sound that might have been wind but sounded too much like whispering. Around midnight, Bear started growling. Not his usual warning growl, but something low and primal that seemed to come from deep in his chest. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap, beam sweeping across the clearing. Nothing. Just the burned earth and the wall of trees beyond. But Bear was looking up. I followed his gaze and felt my blood turn to ice water. High in the branches of the oak directly across from our tent, something was hanging upside down. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks, but then it moved, a slow, deliberate shift that made the branches creak. The thing was too large to be a person, but had the wrong proportions to be any animal I knew. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse of pale skin stretched over bones that were too long, too thin. Eyes that reflected the light like a nocturnal animal's, but wrong. Too many of them, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. When it opened what might have been a mouth, I saw rows of teeth like broken glass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing cocked its head, too far, nearly a full rotation, and made a sound that was part screech, part laughter. Then it was gone, dropping from the branch with impossible grace and vanishing into the forest without so much as rustling the leaves. Bear was beside himself, barking and snarling at the tree line. I managed to call him back to the tent, but he spent the rest of the night pressed against the nylon wall, trembling. Neither of us slept. Dawn brought no relief. My phone was completely dead despite having a full charge the night before. The GPS unit showed only static. Even my analog compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. When I checked my backpack, half my food was missing, not eaten, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. "We're getting out of here," I told Bear, but when I tried to retrace our steps to the trail, every direction looked the same. The forest had become a maze of identical trees and unmarked paths that seemed to twist back on themselves. After 2 hours of hiking, we ended up back at the burned clearing. That's when I noticed the tracks. Footprints in the black earth around our campsite, not human, but not animal either. They had too many toes, and the claws had left deep gouges in the hard-packed soil. The prints circled our tent multiple times, and in some places, I could see where whatever made them had stood still for long periods, as if watching us sleep. Bear had found something at the edge of the clearing. He was whining and pawing at a pile of what looked like sticks, but when I got closer, I realized they were bones. Old bones, bleached white by sun and weather. Some were definitely animal, deer, maybe bear, but others were the wrong shape, wrong size, too human. I grabbed Bear's collar and pulled him away, but not before I saw the skulls. 3 of them, arranged in a neat triangle at the base of the largest oak. They had been human once, but they'd been changed somehow. The eye sockets were elongated, stretched upward as if something had been pulling at them from the inside. The jaws had been broken and reset, extended forward to accommodate extra rows of teeth. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I packed up camp. Whatever was in these woods, we needed to get away from it before nightfall. I picked a direction that felt right and started walking, Bear close at my heels. The forest seemed to resist our progress. Branches caught at my clothes and pack with deliberate malice. Roots appeared underfoot just as I was stepping forward, sending me stumbling. The very air felt thick like walking through honey. And always, just at the edge of hearing, was that whispering sound that might have been wind, but definitely wasn't. By late afternoon, we'd made maybe 2 miles of actual progress despite hours of hiking. The sun was already behind the ridge, and the forest was growing dark. I was starting to panic when Bear suddenly bolted ahead, barking excitedly. He'd found something, a small cabin nestled in a grove of pine trees, smoke rising from its chimney. The sight of it nearly brought me to tears. Civilization meant people, and people meant a way out of this nightmare. I ran toward the cabin, calling out as I approached. "Hello, anyone home? I need help." The door opened before I reached it, revealing an elderly man with kind eyes and a white beard. He was wearing overalls and a flannel shirt, exactly what you'd expect from someone living off-grid in the Arkansas wilderness. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice warm and gravelly. "You look like you've had a rough go of it. Name's Thomas Mills. This is my place." "David Jones," I panted, trying to catch my breath. "Thank God I found you. I've been lost in these woods for 2 days. My GPS isn't working, my phone's dead." "Easy there, son." Thomas held up a weathered hand. "You're safe now. Why don't you come inside, get yourself some hot food? Your dog, too. Looks like he could use some rest." I almost cried with relief. The cabin was exactly what I needed: warm, dry, filled with the smell of wood smoke and home cooking. Thomas was the perfect mountain hermit, full of stories about living off the land and completely unbothered by our sudden appearance. He fed us both, beef stew for me, leftover deer scraps for Bear, and offered to let us stay the night. "Trail down to the main roads just about 3 miles south," he said, pointing out his window. "Easy walk in the morning. You'll be back to civilization by noon." Bear seemed to relax for the first time since we'd entered the forest. He curled up by the fireplace and actually fell asleep, something he hadn't done since our first night. Thomas and I talked for hours, about the mountains, about life, about my recent troubles. He was a good listener, the kind of man who'd seen enough of the world to offer perspective without judgment. I should have noticed the inconsistencies, the way Thomas never seemed to blink, how his teeth looked too white, too sharp in the firelight, the fact that the shadows in the cabin didn't quite match the furniture that should have been casting them. But I was so desperate for human contact, so relieved to be safe, that I ignored the warning signs. It wasn't until I woke up in the middle of the night that I realized Bear was gone. I'd been sleeping on Thomas's couch, and the dog's bed by the fireplace was empty. No big deal. He probably just went outside to relieve himself. But when I looked out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Bear was standing in the yard, perfectly still, staring directly at the cabin. He'd been out there for who knows how long, not moving, not blinking, just watching. When I tapped on the glass, he didn't react. When I opened the door and called his name, he didn't even twitch an ear. "Bear, come here. Boy." He turned toward me then, and I saw his eyes. They were wrong. Not the warm brown I knew, but black from edge to edge. When he opened his mouth, no sound came out, but his lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were too long, too sharp. Human teeth. I slammed the door and stumbled backward, heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't my dog. This was something else wearing Bear's shape, and it wanted inside. "Thomas," I whispered, but when I turned around, the old man was standing right behind me. Too close. Close enough that I could feel his breath on my face, cold and smelling of old meat. "Something wrong, son?" His voice was the same, but his smile was all wrong. Too wide, stretching nearly to his ears. And his eyes were black, just like the thing outside that used to be my dog. I ran, burst through the front door and past the bear thing still standing motionless in the yard. Behind me, I could hear Thomas laughing, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. The laughter followed me as I plunged into the forest, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches. I had no destination except away. Away from the cabin, away from whatever Thomas really was, away from the abomination that had stolen my dog's body. Thorns tore at my clothes and skin, but I didn't slow down until my legs gave out and I collapsed against the trunk of a massive oak. The forest was silent around me. No insects, no nightbirds, no small animals moving through the underbrush. Just silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. I tried to catch my breath while figuring out what to do next. That's when I heard Bear whimpering. The sound was coming from somewhere above me. I looked up and saw him, the real him, hanging upside down from a thick branch about 20 feet off the ground. He was alive, but wrong, somehow stretched and distorted like someone had been pulling at his limbs. His eyes were still brown, still warm, still undeniably Bear's. They were also filled with terror and pain that made me want to vomit. "Bear," I whispered, and he whimpered again, trying to wag his tail. The movement sent him spinning slowly on whatever was holding him, and I could see that his body had been modified. Bones extended where they shouldn't be. Joints bent in directions that defied anatomy. Someone or something had been experimenting with him, changing him, turning him into something between dog and the creatures I'd seen in the trees. I had to get him down. I searched around until I found a fallen branch long enough to reach, then climbed the oak as high as I dared. Bear was suspended by what looked like spider webs, but the strands were thick as rope and strong as steel. It took nearly an hour of careful work to cut through them with my pocket knife. When Bear finally dropped into my arms, he felt wrong. Too light, like his bones were hollow. But he licked my face with desperate affection, and I knew this was really him. Whatever had been done to his body, his mind was still intact. "It's okay, boy," I whispered, though we both knew it wasn't. "We're getting out of here." I started walking, carrying Bear because his modified legs couldn't support his weight properly. I had no idea which direction I was heading, but anywhere was better than staying put. The forest around us grew stranger with each step. Trees twisted into impossible spirals. Rocks floated 3 feet off the ground. In the distance, I could see lights that moved like living things, dancing between the branches in patterns that hurt to watch. Dawn found us at the edge of another clearing, this one containing what remained of an old logging camp. Rusted equipment lay scattered around a collection of buildings that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. Most were in ruins, but one seemed structurally sound enough to provide shelter. I carried Bear inside and made him as comfortable as possible on some old canvas tarps. He was getting worse. His breathing was labored, and the modifications to his body were causing him obvious pain. I needed to find help, but first I needed to understand what we were dealing with. The building we'd sheltered in had been some kind of office. There were still papers scattered across a desk by the window, requisition forms, safety reports, payroll records, all dated from 1987. But underneath the official paperwork, I found something else, a handwritten journal bound in cracked leather. The entries were written in a shaky hand, filled with spelling errors and crossed-out words. But the story they told made my skin crawl. October 15th, 1987. Something's wrong with the woods around mile marker 23. The boys are reporting strange sounds at night, equipment going missing. Johnson swears he saw something watching them from the tree line yesterday, but when he went to investigate, there was nothing there. October 18th, 1987. Lost contact with the evening shift. Found their equipment scattered around the clearing like something had been playing with it. No sign of the men. Search party going out in the morning. October 20th, 1987. Search party never came back. It's just me and Peterson now. The radio's been dead for 3 days. Peterson says we should hike out to the main road, but I've seen what's in those woods. It doesn't want us to leave. October 22nd, 1987. Peterson's gone. Went to gather firewood this morning and never came back. Found his clothes in a neat pile by the creek, but they were torn, like something had shredded them from the inside. I can hear him calling my name from the forest, but it's not his voice anymore. October 24th, 1987. It came for me last night. Stood outside my window for hours, wearing Peterson's face but wrong, everything wrong. The eyes were in the wrong places, and when it smiled, I could see all the way down its throat. It knows I'm writing this. It wants me to know it knows. October 25th, 1987. I understand now. It's not just one thing. It's hunger itself. Ancient hunger that was here before the trees, before anything. It takes what it wants and wears it like clothes. It's been doing this for longer than anyone can remember, and it'll keep doing it long after the last human dies. The Osage called it the wendigo, but that's just one name for something that has 1,000. It hollows you out and fills you with itself, makes you hungry for things you should never want to eat. I can feel it starting in me now. The wanting. The needing. October 26th, 1987. So hungry. God, I'm so hungry. The journal ended there, but I'd read enough. The wendigo, a creature from Native American legend, a cannibalistic monster born from starvation and desperation. But this was worse than any folklore. This thing didn't just eat people. It transformed them, made them into extensions of its own hunger. Bear whimpered, and I looked down to see that his eyes had started to change color. Not the solid black I'd seen in the fake bear, but something worse. They were becoming silver, reflective, like looking into a funhouse mirror. He was still my dog, but whatever the wendigo had done to him was progressing. "Fight it, boy," I whispered, but I could see him losing the battle. His breathing became more labored, and when he tried to lick my hand, his tongue was too long, almost prehensile. That's when I heard the voices outside. Multiple people calling my name, their tones filled with concern and urgency. I recognized some of them. Thomas from the cabin, park rangers I'd met on previous trips, even Sarah's voice among them. They were organizing a search party, they said. They'd been looking for me for days. "David, David, are you in there? We're here to help." Every instinct screamed at me not to respond. These weren't people. They were things wearing people's faces, just like the journal described. But Bear was dying and I was out of options. Maybe if I could get past them, find some way to break the wendigo's hold on this place. I picked up Bear and stepped outside. They were arranged in a semicircle around the building, a dozen figures that looked almost human until you examined them closely. Thomas was there, still wearing his kindly mountain man facade. The park rangers had the right uniforms, but faces that were too symmetrical, too perfect. And Sarah? Sarah looked exactly like herself except for the eyes. Those silver, reflective eyes that showed me my own face twisted with terror. "Oh, David," she said, voice full of false sympathy. "Look what you've done to that poor animal. Why don't you let us help?" "Stay back," I warned, but my voice cracked. Bear was getting heavier in my arms, his modified body becoming more distorted by the minute. "There's nowhere to run," Thomas said, still smiling that too wide smile. "This is our home. It's been our home for longer than your species has existed. You're the intruders here." The circle began to close, and I backed toward the tree line. But the forest behind me was full of more shapes. Dozens of them, all wearing faces I might have known once. They moved with predatory grace, patient as spiders waiting for prey to exhaust itself. That's when Bear made his choice. With the last of his strength, he bit down on my wrist, not hard enough to seriously injure me, but enough to draw blood. The moment my blood hit the ground, something changed. The false people stopped advancing, confusion replacing predatory hunger on their stolen faces. "He's marked," one of them whispered. "The blood knows." Bear looked up at me with eyes that were still partly brown, still partly him. In that look, I understood. He'd been changed, but he'd retained enough of himself to fight back in the only way he could. My blood was protection. Not permanent, but enough to give me a chance. "Run," he said. The voice came from his throat, but it was wrong. Too deep, too resonant. The wendigo's changes were accelerating, taking the last of what made him Bear. But in his eyes, I could see one final flash of the loyal companion who'd hiked thousands of miles with me. "I love you too, boy," I whispered, then I ran. The forest exploded into chaos behind me. The false people were shrieking in voices that belonged to no human throat, and I could hear Bear, or what he was becoming, fighting them, buying me time with his life. I ran blindly through the trees, following what might have been a deer trail. My blood continued to drip from the bite wound, and wherever it hit the ground, the wrongness seemed to recede slightly. The twisted trees straightened. The floating rocks fell. The forest remembered what it was supposed to be. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I saw it. A break in the tree line, and beyond it, a stretch of asphalt that had never looked more beautiful. Highway 7, the main road that ran north-south through the Ouayita Mountains. I stumbled out of the forest just as a state trooper's car came around the bend. The officer who picked me up said I'd been missing for 6 days. My family had been frantic. There were search parties, helicopters, dogs, none of which had found any trace of me or my campsite. When I tried to tell him what happened, he nodded politely and suggested I might have become disoriented, possibly hypothermic. The mind played tricks under stress, he said. They never found Bear's body. The official report listed him as lost to wildlife, probably coyotes. When I insisted on returning to search for him with a ranger escort, we couldn't find the burned clearing, the cabin, or the abandoned logging camp. According to the Forest Service, there had never been a logging operation in that part of the mountains. The bite wound on my wrist healed badly, leaving a scar that looks like teeth marks. Sometimes late at night it still aches, but it also serves as a reminder and a warning. Bear saved my life by marking me, but the protection won't last forever. The wendigo is patient. It can wait. I've done research since then, digging through old newspapers and historical records. There are stories going back to the 1800s of people disappearing in the Ouachitas, hunting parties that never returned, entire families that vanished while camping. The pattern is always the same. People go into the deep woods and either never come out, or they come out wrong. The Osage Nation has a reservation north of the mountains now, but their ancestors knew these hills well. I found a tribal elder willing to speak about the old stories. He called it Wendigo Quiche, the hungry ghost. He said his great-grandmother remembered when it first came to the mountains, driven south by railroad construction and the slaughter of the buffalo. It had been starving for so long that it became starvation itself. He told me. And starvation was patient. The elder gave me a piece of advice. Never go into the deep woods alone. Never camp in places where nothing grows. And never, ever trust a familiar face in an unfamiliar place. I don't camp anymore. I can't even look at forest without remembering the sound of bear fighting something that used to be human. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I hear him barking. Not the distorted thing he became, but his real bark, joyful and strong and calling me home. I know it's not really him. I know it's just the wendigo wearing his voice like a mask, trying to lure me back into the trees. But part of me wants to go anyway. Part of me is still hungry for the companionship I lost, even if it comes with a terrible price. That's how it starts, according to the research I've done. First you hear the voices, then you start to hunger. Not for food, for something else. Something that walks on two legs and thinks it's safe in the civilized world. The bite mark on my wrist throbs as I write this, and I can feel something moving just under the skin. The protection Bear gave me is fading, day by day. Soon I'll have to make a choice. Return to the mountains and face what's waiting there, or stay in the world and risk becoming something that hunts the people I once protected. I'm writing this down so someone will know what really happened in the Ouachita National Forest. So they'll understand why David Jones disappeared for good, whether into the woods or into something that wears his face but isn't him anymore. If you're reading this, stay away from the deep places. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Buffalo Point in Arkansas, deep in the heart of the Buffalo National River area, where the ancient Ozark Mountains hold secrets that should never be disturbed. David Jones and I had been planning this backcountry camping trip for months. We both needed to escape. Him from his recent divorce, me from the suffocating corporate job that was slowly killing my soul. The Buffalo National River promised isolation, pristine wilderness, and the kind of silence that could wash away the noise of modern life. What we found instead was something that still wakes me up screaming 3 months later. We drove down from Little Rock on a gray October morning, the kind where the sky looks like dirty cotton and the air carries the promise of an early winter. David was quieter than usual, picking at the steering wheel with his fingernails, a nervous habit that had gotten worse since Sarah left him. His beard had grown scraggly, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "You sure about this place?" he asked as we turned off Highway 65 onto the narrow gravel road that would take us to our trailhead near Ponca. "I mean, it's pretty remote. No cell service for miles." "That's the point," I said, watching the dense forest close in around us. Ancient oak and hickory trees formed a canopy so thick that even in daylight, shadows pooled beneath them like spilled ink. When's the last time you went more than an hour without checking your phone?" He laughed, but it sounded forced. "Fair point." The parking area at Buffalo Point was nearly empty, just our beat-up Subaru and a park ranger's truck. The ranger, a weathered man named Tom Hendricks, emerged from the visitor center as we shouldered our packs. "Y'all heading into the backcountry?" he asked, eyeing our gear with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen too many inexperienced hikers get themselves into trouble. "Planned a 3-day hike," David replied, "following the Buffalo River Trail up to Steel Creek, then cutting over to the old homestead sites near Dismal Creek." Hendricks frowned. "That's pretty remote country. Haven't had many folks through there lately." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Had some unusual wildlife activity reported in that area. Might want to stick to the main trails." "Unusual how?" I asked. The ranger's weathered face grew troubled. "Tracks that don't match any known species. Livestock gone missing from farms 20 miles away. What was left of them was found near Dismal Creek. Department of Wildlife can't explain it." David and I exchanged glances. We'd both grown up in Arkansas, hunted these woods since we were teenagers. We knew the local wildlife, black bears, coyotes, the occasional mountain lion. Nothing that would explain what Hendricks was describing. "We'll be careful," I assured him, though something cold had settled in my stomach. The first day's hike was everything we'd hoped for. The Buffalo River Trail wound through pristine wilderness, following the crystal-clear river as it carved through limestone bluffs that rose like cathedral walls on either side. The sound of water over stone was hypnotic, and for the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax. We made camp that evening on a gravel bar beside the river, the kind of perfect spot that made you understand why people fell in love with Arkansas's wild places. David seemed more like his old self as we cooked dinner over our camp stove, sharing stories about our college days and laughing at inside jokes that had aged like fine wine. But as darkness fell, the atmosphere changed. The normal sounds of the forest, owls calling, branches creaking in the wind, the distant yip of coyotes, gradually faded until an oppressive silence settled over our camp like a heavy blanket. Even the river seemed to quiet, its usual babble reduced to an uneasy whisper. "It's too quiet," David said, voicing what we were both thinking. He poked at our campfire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. That's when we heard it for the first time, a sound that made every primitive instinct in my body scream danger. It started as a low moan, almost human but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the limestone bluffs until it was impossible to determine its origin. "What the hell was that?" David whispered. Before I could answer, the moan came again, closer this time, and definitely from upstream. It rose in pitch until it became a wail of such pure anguish that I felt tears spring to my eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it cut off, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing and the hammering of my heart. "Probably just an owl," I said, but my voice shook. "Or maybe a mountain lion. They can make some weird sounds." David nodded, but I could see he wasn't convinced any more than I was. We sat in tense silence for another hour, jumping at every small sound, before finally retreating to our tent. Sleep came in fitful snatches, broken by half-remembered dreams of something moving through the darkness just beyond our firelight. The second day started normally enough. We broke camp early and continued up the Buffalo River Trail, making good time despite the increasingly rugged terrain. The trail began to climb away from the river, winding through dense forest where the canopy blocked out most of the sky. It was around noon when David first mentioned feeling watched. "There's something out there," he said, stopping suddenly on the trail and scanning the trees around us. "I keep seeing movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there." I'd been feeling it too. That prickly sensation between your shoulder blades that meant unseen eyes were tracking your every move. The forest felt different than it had the day before, charged with a malevolent energy that made every shadow suspect. "Probably just deer," I said, though I didn't believe it. We pressed on, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. Branches would crack in the distance, always just out of sight. Leaves would rustle in the still air, as if something large was moving parallel to our trail, keeping pace but staying hidden. By late afternoon, we reached the turnoff for Dismal Creek. The name suddenly seemed prophetic. The side trail was barely visible, little more than a game path that wound through increasingly dense forest. According to our topographic map, it would take us to the ruins of an old homestead, then connect with another trail that would loop us back to the Buffalo River. "Maybe we should stick to the main trail," David suggested, eyeing the narrow path with obvious reluctance. But I was already committed to our planned route, and something about his nervousness made me more determined to continue. "Come on, we've hiked worse trails than this. Besides, the homestead ruins are supposed to be interesting." How wrong I was. The trail to Dismal Creek descended into a hollow that felt wrong from the moment we entered it. The air was colder, thick with the smell of decay and something else, something musky and predatory that made my nose wrinkle. The trees here were different too, twisted into unnatural shapes as if they'd been tortured by some unseen force. We found the homestead ruins just as the sun was beginning to set. What remained of the cabin was little more than a foundation and a stone chimney, surrounded by the rusted remnants of farm equipment. But it was the bones that made us both stop in our tracks. They were scattered around the ruins like macabre decorations, some clearly animal, others disturbingly ambiguous. Many showed evidence of gnawing, deep gouges that spoke of teeth designed for rending flesh, and they were fresh. Some still had scraps of meat and hide clinging to them. "Jesus Christ," David breathed, covering his nose against the stench of rotting meat that hung over the site like a fog. "We're not camping here," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted to admit. But darkness was falling fast, and we were already exhausted from the day's hike. The nearest alternative campsite was miles away, back up the trail we'd just descended. We had no choice but to make camp in this cursed place. We set up our tent as far from the ruins as possible, on a small rise that gave us a clear view of the surrounding forest. Neither of us spoke much as we prepared dinner, both lost in our own increasingly dark thoughts. The silence that had troubled us the night before was back, but now it felt actively hostile, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation. "I don't like this place," David said as we sat by our fire, picking at food neither of us had appetite for. "Something bad happened here. You can feel it." He was right. The very air seemed poisoned with old violence, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, certain that something was watching us from the tree line. Every shadow seemed to hide teeth and claws. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. The fire, which had burned bright and steady the night before, now flickered and guttered despite the still air. The flames danced in unnatural colors, blues and greens that had no business in a wood fire, and cast writhing shadows that looked almost alive. "Maybe we should head back tomorrow," I suggested, hating myself for the admission of fear but unable to shake the growing certainty that we were in terrible danger. David nodded eagerly. "First light. We'll pack up and get the hell out of here." But we never got the chance. The attack came just after midnight, announced by the same inhuman wailing we'd heard the night before, but closer now, much closer. The sound seemed to come from directly above our tent, as if something was perched in the trees overhead, looking down at us like we were prey in a trap. "What the fuck is that?" David hissed, fumbling for his flashlight. The wailing rose to a shriek that made my teeth ache, then cut off abruptly. In the sudden silence that followed, we could hear something moving around our camp, heavy footsteps that circled our tent like a predator stalking its prey. I grabbed my own flashlight and unzipped the tent flap, playing the beam across our campsite. What I saw made my blood freeze. Our campfire, which we'd banked before going to bed, was now completely cold, the ashes scattered as if by a great wind. Our food, which we'd hung properly in a bear bag 15 feet off the ground, was gone. The rope cut clean through, leaving only a short stub hanging from the tree branch. But it was the tracks that truly terrified me. They surrounded our tent in a perfect circle, but they weren't like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were roughly human in shape, but impossibly large, with long claw marks extending from what would have been the toes. Whatever had made them was bipedal and tall, very tall, based on the stride length. "David," I whispered, "we need to get out of here, now." But when I turned back to the tent, David was gone. I called his name softly, then louder when there was no response. The tent flap hung open, moving slightly in a breeze that I couldn't feel. His sleeping bag was empty but unzipped from the inside, as if he'd gotten up and walked out on his own. "David!" I shouted, no longer caring about stealth. "David, where are you?" My voice echoed off the surrounding hills, mocking and distorted. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my knees weak with terror. David's voice calling from somewhere in the forest. "Mike! Mike! Help me! I'm lost!" But there was something wrong with the voice. It was David's, unmistakably, but it was too calm, too measured. David, in real distress, would be panicking, his voice high and strained. This David sounded almost amused. "Where are you?" I called back, playing my flashlight beam across the tree line. "Over here, by the creek. I fell and hurt my ankle." The voice was coming from downstream, near Dismal Creek itself. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I grabbed a larger flashlight and my hiking poles and set off into the forest. I had to find David. He was my best friend, and if he was hurt, the forest at night was a maze of shifting shadows and deceptive sounds. My flashlight beam seemed pitifully small against the vast darkness, and more than once I stumbled over roots and rocks that seemed to reach out for my feet like grasping hands. The smell I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, a nauseating mix of rotting meat and animal musk that made my eyes water. "David, keep talking," I called. "I'm coming. I'm here, Mike, right here." But now the voice seemed to be coming from a different direction entirely, upstream instead of down. I stopped, confusion and fear warring in my mind. Had David moved? Was the rocky terrain causing echoes that confused the direction? "David! Over here!" The voice was behind me now, back toward our camp. "I found something. You need to see this." I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. Something was very wrong. David's voice kept moving, always just out of sight, always calling me in a different direction. And there was something else, a subtle wrongness to the voice that I couldn't quite identify. "David, stay where you are," I shouted. "I'm coming to you." But as I started back toward what I thought was our camp, I realized I was lost. The forest all looked the same in the darkness, and in my panic to find David, I'd wandered farther from our tent than I'd intended. Every tree looked identical. Every shadow could hide any number of horrors. That's when I heard the laughter. It started low and quiet, almost human, but it quickly rose in pitch and volume until it became something that no human throat could produce. It was David's laugh, but stretched and distorted until it sounded like the cry of some monstrous bird. The sound seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the trees until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. And then I saw him. David stood about 30 feet away, just at the edge of my flashlight beam. He was facing away from me, standing perfectly still with his arms hanging loosely at his sides. Something about his posture was wrong, too rigid, like a puppet hanging from strings. "David," I called softly, "are you okay?" Slowly, with jerky, unnatural movements, he turned around. What I saw made me stumble backward, a scream catching in my throat. It was David's face, but wrong in fundamental ways that my mind struggled to process. His eyes were too wide, showing white all the way around the iris, and they didn't blink. His mouth was stretched in a grin that was too wide for any human face, showing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "I found something, Mike," he said, and his voice was David's, but the words came out in the wrong rhythm, as if whatever was speaking was still learning how to use his vocal cords. "Something wonderful." "David, what happened to you?" I managed to whisper. The thing wearing David's face tilted its head at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "Nothing happened to me, Mike. I'm better now, much better. You should come see what I found. You should join me." It took a step toward me, and I could see that its movements were all wrong. Its legs bent in places where there shouldn't be joints, and its arms swayed with a boneless fluidity that made my stomach lurch. "It's hungry, Mike," the David thing said, its impossible grin never wavering. "It's been so hungry for so long. But you can help feed it. You can be part of it, like I am now." I ran. I crashed through the forest like a madman, branches tearing at my face and clothes, roots trying to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had been David following, but it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I could hear twigs snapping under its feet and the sound of something large moving through the underbrush with inhuman speed. And it was laughing. That horrible, distorted version of David's laugh that grew louder and more maniacal with each passing second. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and compress like taffy, and I lost all sense of direction. The forest became a blur of black shadows and grasping branches, and my flashlight beam danced wildly as I stumbled through the darkness. Finally, my legs gave out and I collapsed beside a large oak tree, gasping for breath and listening for sounds of pursuit. The forest was silent again, but it was the silence of a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. I checked my watch with shaking hands. 3:17 a.m. Dawn was still hours away. That's when I heard David's voice again, but this time it was different. Weaker. More human. "Mike! Mike! Help me! Please!" This time the voice sounded right. It was David's voice, full of pain and terror, coming from somewhere nearby. But how could I trust it? I'd already been fooled once by whatever was hunting me in these woods. "David," I called softly. "Mike, thank God. I don't know what happened. I woke up and I was somewhere else, somewhere dark. There was something there with me, something horrible. It showed me things, Mike. Terrible things." The voice was definitely coming from my left, from what looked like a small ravine. Against my better judgment, I crept toward the sound, keeping my flashlight beam low. "Keep talking, David. I'm coming." It was inside my head, Mike. I could feel it moving around in there, learning about me, copying me. It wanted to be me, but better, stronger. It showed me what it really looks like, and Mike, we need to get out of here. Now. I reached the edge of the ravine and played my light down into it. David was there, huddled against the far wall with his knees drawn up to his chest. He looked terrible. His clothes were torn, his face was covered in scratches, and his eyes held a haunted look that I'd never seen before. "David, what happened to you?" "I don't know. I remember going to sleep in the tent and then I was somewhere else. Somewhere cold and dark like a cave. There was something there, something that... Oh God, Mike, it was wearing my face. It was walking around wearing my face." A chill ran down my spine. If David was here, then what had I encountered in the forest? "We need to get back to the tent," I said. "Get our gear and get the hell out of here." "No." David's voice was sharp with panic. "We can't go back there. That's where it's waiting for us. It knows we'll come back for our stuff." He was right. Whatever that thing was, it would be expecting us to return to our camp. But without our gear, we were trapped in the wilderness with no food, no shelter, and no way to signal for help. "Then what do you suggest?" "The ranger station," David said, struggling to his feet. "It's only about 5 miles back down the main trail. We can make it if we move fast." But as he climbed out of the ravine, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. David's boots were clean, perfectly clean, without a speck of mud or a single leaf clinging to them. Impossible, considering he'd supposedly been dragged through the forest by some unknown creature. "David," I said carefully, "where exactly were you when this thing took you?" "I told you. I don't remember. I was asleep and then I was in that cave." His voice carried a note of irritation that seemed out of place considering the circumstances. "But your boots," I pressed. "They're completely clean. How is that possible?" David looked down at his feet. and for just a moment his expression changed. The fear and confusion vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. But then it was gone so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. I don't know," he said. "Maybe it cleaned them. Maybe it doesn't want to leave tracks." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about it felt wrong. I found myself studying David's face more closely, looking for the subtle signs that would tell me whether this was really my friend or another trick. "David, what was the name of your ex-wife's cat?" "What? Mike, what are you talking about? We need to get out of here." "Just answer the question." David's face twisted with anger. "This is not the time for your paranoid bullshit, Mike. There's something hunting us, and you want to play 20 questions?" But that was wrong, too. David was the paranoid one, not me. He was the one who always checked the locks twice before leaving the house, who kept a baseball bat by his bed, just in case. He would understand my caution, even encourage it. I took a step backward, my hand tightening on my flashlight. "You're not David." The thing wearing my friend's face dropped all pretense of humanity. Its expression became flat and emotionless, like a mask that had suddenly been removed. When it spoke, David's voice was overlaid with something else, something ancient and hungry and utterly alien. "Very good, Mike. You're smarter than most. David told me you would be, while I was getting to know him. Where is he? Where's the real David?" The thing smiled, and this time I could see that its teeth really were too sharp, too numerous. "David is here, Mike. He's part of me now. I carry his memories, his experiences, his knowledge of how to hurt you where it would cause the most damage. Did you know he blames you for his divorce? He thinks you could have talked Sarah out of leaving, but you chose not to because you never really liked her." The words hit me like physical blows, partly because they contained just enough truth to sting. I had thought Sarah was wrong for David, and I hadn't been sorry to see her go. "You're lying," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" "David remembers the night he called you, crying, begging you to help him figure out how to save his marriage. And what did you do? You told him he was better off without her. You told him he deserved someone who appreciated him." My stomach twisted with guilt and confusion. That conversation had happened, but I'd only been trying to help David see that his marriage was toxic, that Sarah had been manipulating and undermining him for years. "I was trying to help him," I whispered. "Were you? Or were you trying to keep your friend available for fishing trips and camping adventures? Were you afraid that if David fixed his marriage, he wouldn't have time for you anymore?" The accusation struck home because there was a grain of truth to it. I had enjoyed having David to myself again, having my old friend back instead of the stressed, unhappy man he'd become during his marriage. "Stop it," I said. "David knows the truth, Mike. He's part of me now, and he understands things so much more clearly. He understands that you're the reason his life fell apart. He understands that you're the reason he's dead." "He's not dead." The thing laughed, and this time the sound was purely inhuman, a chittering, insectile noise that made my skin crawl. "Oh, but he is, Mike. I devoured him hours ago, along with 3 hikers last week and a park ranger the week before that. I'm growing stronger with each meal, learning more about how to be human. Soon, I won't need to hunt anymore. Soon, I'll be able to walk among you without anyone suspecting what I really am." I turned and ran again, but this time I had a destination in mind. The ranger station was only 5 miles away, and if I could reach it, I could get help. I could warn people about what was stalking these woods. Behind me, the creature gave chase, but it seemed to be playing with me, staying just close enough to keep me panicked but never quite catching up. It called to me in David's voice, saying horrible things designed to break my spirit and sap my will to fight. "You know this is your fault, Mike. If you hadn't insisted on coming here, David would still be alive. You killed your best friend." I tried to block out the words, but they burrowed into my mind like parasites, feeding on my guilt and fear. Part of me began to believe them. Maybe I was responsible. Maybe David's death was the price of my selfishness. But another part of me, the part that had kept me alive through 30 years in Arkansas's wild places, refused to give up. I knew these woods even in the dark. I could find my way to the ranger station if I just kept moving, kept thinking. The creature's biggest mistake was assuming I would stick to the trails. Instead, I cut cross-country, using my knowledge of the terrain to take shortcuts that would shave miles off the journey. I waded across Dismal Creek in the darkest part of the night, the icy water shocking my system but helping clear my head. As dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky a pale gray, I finally saw the lights of the ranger station in the distance. I had made it. I was going to survive. But as I emerged from the tree line, I saw that I wasn't alone. Ranger Hendricks was standing on the front porch of the station, his back turned to me as he looked out over the forest. At the sound of my approach, he turned around and I felt my heart sink. His eyes were too wide, showing white all the way around the iris. His mouth was stretched in that same impossible grin I'd seen on the David thing. When he spoke, his voice carried that same wrong rhythm, that same sense of something alien learning to use human vocal cords. "Hello, Mike," he said. "I've been waiting for you." How many of them were there? How long had these creatures been replacing people in the area? The thought of an entire network of these things, slowly infiltrating human society, made my knees weak with terror. "The real ranger," I managed to say. "Where is he?" "Tom is part of me now, just like David, just like the 3 hikers who came through here last week asking about good places to camp. They're all part of the great hunger, Mike, and soon you will be too." I backed away from the station, my mind racing. If I couldn't get help here, where could I go? The nearest town was 20 miles away, and my car was at the Buffalo Point parking area, assuming these things hadn't already found it and disabled it. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to buy time while I figured out my next move. The Hendricks thing tilted its head in that unnatural way. "We've been here for a very long time, Mike. Longer than your species has existed. We've watched you spread across the world, consuming everything in your path, and we've learned from your example. Now it's our turn to feed. But you're not just killing people. You're replacing them." "Death is wasteful," the creature said. "Why destroy what can be improved? When I consume someone, I don't just take their flesh. I take their memories, their knowledge, their connections to other humans. Each person I replace gives me access to dozens more. It's quite efficient, really." A horrible thought occurred to me. "How long have you been doing this?" The thing that looked like Ranger Hendricks smiled wider. "Long enough. Tom was my first 3 months ago. He gave me access to park records, visitor logs, information about people who come into these woods alone or in small groups. David was supposed to be my second, but you proved to be problematic." 3 months. How many people had disappeared in these woods in 3 months? How many families were waiting for loved ones who would never come home? "The livestock killings," I said. "That was you learning to hunt. Practice makes perfect." "Mike!" "And I've had plenty of practice." The creature took a step toward me, and I could see that its movements were becoming more fluid, more human. It was learning, adapting, becoming a more perfect predator with each passing moment. I ran again, but this time I had nowhere to go. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, and for all I knew, more of these creatures were waiting in the darkness between the trees. My only chance was to reach my car and pray that it would still start. The journey back to Buffalo Point took me the better part of the day. I moved carefully, staying off the main trails and avoiding any open areas where I might be spotted. Every shadow could hide one of the creatures, every sound could herald my death. But as the sun began to set again, I finally saw the familiar gleam of metal through the trees. My Subaru was exactly where I'd left it, apparently untouched. I crept up to it carefully, checking for signs of sabotage, but everything seemed normal. The keys were still in my pocket. The engine turned over on the first try. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that I might actually escape this nightmare. But as I pulled out of the parking area, I saw a figure standing beside the road. It was David, looking exactly as he had when we'd first arrived 3 days ago. Healthy, normal, human. He waved at me as I approached, and for a wild moment I thought maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe he really had escaped the creature in the woods. I stopped the car and rolled down the window. "Mike," David said, jogging over to the driver's side. "Thank God you made it out. I've been waiting here for hours, hoping you'd come back for the car." "David?" I could barely speak his name. "How did you get here?" "I managed to get away from that thing," he said. "It was chasing me through the woods, but I found an old hunting cabin and hid there until it gave up looking. Then I made my way back here. Mike, we have to call the authorities. There's something in those woods that shouldn't exist." Everything he was saying sounded right, looked right. This was David, as I'd always known him. No wrong movements, no impossible grin, no alien rhythm to his speech. But I'd been fooled before. "David," I said carefully, "what was your mother's maiden name?" "Johnson," he replied without hesitation. "Mike, what's wrong with you? Why are you asking me these weird questions?" It was the right answer. David's mother had been a Johnson before she married his father, but the creature could have learned that from David's memories. "What did we talk about on the drive up here?" "Your job, my divorce, how we both needed to get away from civilization for a while." Again, the right answer. "What's the name of the bar where we used to go in college?" "Brewster's Tavern." "Mike, you're scaring me. What happened to you in there?" Every answer was correct. Either this really was David, or the creature had a perfect access to his memories. How could I tell the difference? "Get in the car," I said finally. What choice did I have? If this was really David, I couldn't abandon him. If it was the creature, then I was probably dead anyway. David climbed into the passenger seat and I pulled back onto the highway. For a while, we drove in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. David seemed genuinely shaken by his experience, asking questions about what had happened to me that only the real David would ask. But as we got farther from the Buffalo National River area, I began to relax. Whatever those creatures were, they seemed to be confined to the remote wilderness. Once we reached civilization, we could contact the authorities, warn them about the danger lurking in those ancient hills. We were about 20 miles from Little Rock when David spoke again. "Mike," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why didn't you try harder to save my marriage?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. "What?" "You knew Sarah was planning to leave me. She told you at that party last spring, remember? But you never warned me. You never tried to talk her out of it." My blood turned to ice. Sarah had told me she was thinking about divorce, but I'd never mentioned it to David. I'd thought it would be cruel to burden him with that knowledge when there was nothing he could do about it. But I'd never told anyone about that conversation. The only way David could know about it was if— "You're not David," I whispered. The thing in the passenger seat smiled, and this time I could see the two sharp teeth clearly. "No, Mike, I'm not." I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending the car careening off the highway and into a stand of pine trees. The impact threw us both forward against our seatbelts, and I heard the creature's neck snap with a wet, cracking sound. But it just turned its head back to the correct position and laughed. "You can't kill me that easily, Mike. I'm not truly alive in the way you understand it. I'm something much older, much more resilient." I fumbled with my seatbelt, desperate to get out of the car, but the creature was faster. Its hand clamped down on my wrist with inhuman strength, and I could feel the bones grinding together. "I'm tired of playing games," it said, and its voice was no longer even pretending to be human. It was a sound like wind through dead leaves, like the whisper of decay. "I'm going to eat you now, Mike. I'm going to crawl inside your skull and make myself at home in your memories. And then I'm going to drive your car back to Little Rock and begin building my new life." But the creature had made one crucial mistake. In its eagerness to torment me, It had revealed too much about its limitations. It needed to touch me to feed, needed physical contact to consume my memories and identity. I still had my hiking pole clipped to my pack in the back seat. The tungsten carbide tip was designed to bite into rock and ice, and I'd always kept it razor sharp. In one fluid motion, I grabbed the pole and drove the tip into the creature's chest. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The creature's body began to convulse, its skin rippling like water as whatever was inside tried to escape. David's face melted away like wax, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process. Too many teeth, too many eyes, angles that hurt to look at. The creature let out a shriek that shattered the car's windows and sent wildlife fleeing for miles around. Then it collapsed, its stolen body deflating like a punctured balloon until nothing remained but a pile of empty clothes and a smell like sulfur and rotting meat. I stumbled out of the wrecked car on shaking legs, gasping for clean air. In the distance, I could hear sirens. Someone must have seen the crash and called for help. Soon, there would be police and paramedics and questions I didn't know how to answer. How do you explain something that shouldn't exist? How do you convince people that ancient horrors still stalk the wilderness, wearing the faces of the dead? The authorities would think I was suffering from trauma-induced hallucinations, and maybe they'd be right to think so. But I know what I saw in those woods. I know what hunted me through the darkness and wore my best friend's face like a mask. And I know that somewhere in the vast wilderness of Arkansas, there are more of them waiting. The official report listed David Jones as a missing person, presumed dead after a hiking accident in the Buffalo National River area. Search teams combed the woods for weeks but found no trace of him. Ranger Tom Hendricks was also listed as missing around the same time, though the connection was never made officially. I tried to tell my story to anyone who would listen, but as I'd expected, no one believed me. I was referred to therapists and prescribed medications for what they assumed was survivor's guilt and PTSD. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince people and focused on healing. But I never stopped watching the news for reports of missing hikers and campers in Arkansas's remote areas. And when those reports come, as they inevitably do, I remember David's face melting away like wax and something inhuman grinning at me with too many teeth. The wilderness is vast and old, full of secrets that humanity has forgotten. Some of those secrets are beautiful, worthy of protection and preservation. Others are hungry things that wear human faces and feed on human suffering. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the trees, My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Buffalo National River Wilderness area of Arkansas, deep in the Ozark Mountains where the ancient forests still hold secrets that civilized men were never meant to discover. It was supposed to be a simple 4-day hiking trip, just me, my college roommate David Jones, and our mutual friend from work, Christopher Hernandez. We'd planned this getaway for months, needing to escape the suffocating routine of our accounting jobs in Little Rock. The Buffalo River area seemed perfect, remote enough to feel like an adventure, but with established trails that wouldn't challenge 3 guys whose most strenuous exercise was climbing the stairs to our second-floor apartments. I should have paid attention to the warnings. The park ranger at the visitor center, a weathered man named Earl whose eyes seemed to hold too much knowledge, had been unusually insistent about staying on marked trails. "Y'all boys be real careful out there," he'd said, his Arkansas drawl thick with something that sounded almost like fear. "We've had incidents in the backcountry, folks going missing. Some come back different." David had laughed it off. What, like bear attacks? At 6'2", with the build of a former high school football player, David had always been the confident one, the leader of our little group. "We've got bear spray and enough common sense to hang our food." Earl's expression had darkened. "Bears don't explain everything that happens out there, son. There's old things in them woods, old and hungry." Christopher, ever the pragmatist, had simply nodded politely and gathered our permits. Chris was the quiet one among us, Methodical and careful. The kind of guy who actually read instruction manuals and checked weather reports twice. He'd been looking forward to this trip more than any of us, having recently gone through a messy divorce that left him hollow-eyed and desperate for distraction. We should have listened to Earl. We should have turned around and driven back to Little Rock. Instead, we loaded our packs and headed into the wilderness, following the Ozark Highlands Trail deeper into the heart of darkness that waited among the ancient oaks and towering bluffs. The first day had been perfect, almost too perfect. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of dying leaves and rich earth. The trail wound through dense hardwood forests punctuated by dramatic limestone bluffs that rose like cathedral walls on either side of us. We'd stopped frequently to take pictures and marvel at the scenery, feeling like explorers discovering uncharted territory. "This is exactly what we needed," David had said as we set up camp near a small creek about 8 miles from the trailhead. The sound of running water was soothing, and we'd found a nice clearing surrounded by towering white oaks that had probably been growing since before Arkansas was even a state. Christopher had been unusually talkative that first evening, sharing stories about his childhood camping trips with his father before the old man had died of cancer 3 years ago. "He always said the wilderness could heal a man's soul," Chris mused, staring into our campfire. "Said there was something pure about it. Something that reminded you what really mattered." The fire had burned bright and warm, crackling cheerfully as we cooked dinner and shared a bottle of bourbon that David had smuggled in despite the park regulations. We'd fallen asleep to the gentle sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant owl calls, the creek babbling over smooth stones. I woke up around 3 a.m. to absolute silence. The sudden lack of sound was so complete, so unnatural, that it jolted me awake like a physical blow. No wind in the trees, no water sounds, no night birds, nothing. Even our campfire, which should have been reduced to glowing embers, was completely cold and dark. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, but the screen wouldn't turn on despite having a full charge when I'd gone to sleep. "David?" I whispered. "Chris?" No response. I reached toward David's sleeping bag and found it empty, the zipper open from the inside. Christopher's was the same, both unoccupied, both unzipped from within as if they'd simply vanished into the night. Panic started to build in my chest like a living thing, clawing at my ribs. I sat up, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Our campsite looked wrong somehow. Older, more weathered. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching down like gnarled fingers. Even the smell was different. Less earthy autumn freshness, more like wet decay and something else I couldn't identify. "David!" I called out, louder now. "Christopher!" My voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness as if the forest itself was absorbing the sound. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, but the beam was weak and flickering despite fresh batteries. The pale light revealed our gear scattered around the campsite. Backpacks overturned, food containers split open, contents spilled and spoiled as if they'd been sitting there for weeks instead of hours. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It started low, almost subsonic, like the rumble of distant thunder. But then it changed, becoming more focused, more deliberate. It was a humming. No, not humming. Chanting. Something was chanting in a language I didn't recognize, the words seeming to twist and writhe in the air like living things. The sound was coming from deeper in the forest, past the creek and into the dense undergrowth where the moonlight couldn't penetrate. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself walking toward it. My legs moved without conscious direction, as if something else was controlling them. The chanting grew louder as I approached, and I could make out 2 distinct voices joining the inhuman chorus. My heart nearly stopped when I recognized them, David and Christopher. But there was something wrong with how they sounded. Their voices were too deep, too resonant, like they were speaking from the bottom of a well. I pushed through a screen of thorny bushes and emerged into a small clearing I was certain hadn't been there the day before. In the center stood a massive oak tree that had to be centuries old, its trunk easily 10 feet in diameter. Symbols were carved deep into its bark, symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. David and Christopher stood on either side of the tree, facing each other across its massive trunk. They were completely naked, their skin pale as bone in the weak moonlight. But it was their eyes that made me want to scream. Their eyes were solid black, reflecting no light at all, like holes punched through reality itself. Between them, carved into the earth at the base of the tree, was a rough circle filled with what looked like old bones. Animal bones, I told myself. They had to be animal bones, but some of them looked disturbingly human-sized. The chanting stopped abruptly, and both of my friends turned to look at me with those horrible empty eyes. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other in perfect silence. Then David smiled, a wide, predatory grin that revealed teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Michael," he said, and his voice was like rustling leaves mixed with something wet and hungry. "You're just in time for the offering." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My body felt heavy, disconnected, like I was moving through thick syrup. Christopher began walking toward me, his movements too fluid, too graceful for a human body. There was something growing from his shoulders, dark, twisted shapes that looked almost like wing bones. "The old hunger is awakening," Christopher said, his voice now carrying harmonics that made my teeth ache. "It has slept beneath these mountains for so long, waiting for the right confluence of blood and desperate souls. We called to it Michael. In our pain and emptiness, we called without knowing." I managed to stumble backward, crashing through the underbrush. Behind me, I could hear laughter that didn't sound human anymore. Wild, echoing sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I ran blindly through the dark forest, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, thorns ripping gouges in my face and arms. When I finally stopped, gasping and bleeding, I realized I was completely lost. The forest around me looked alien now, ancient beyond measure. The trees were massive, their trunks twisted into impossible spirals. Phosphorescent fungi glowed sickly green on rotting logs, and the air tasted of copper and decay. My watch had stopped working, its digital display showing only scrambled symbols. When I tried to use my compass, the needle spun wildly before pointing in directions that couldn't possibly exist. The GPS on my phone showed my location as coordinates that placed me somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I wandered for what felt like hours through that nightmare landscape, calling out for help that I knew wouldn't come. The forest had become a maze designed by madness, its paths leading in circles that somehow brought me to places I'd never been before. Every direction looked the same, endless trees stretching into suffocating darkness, broken only by limestone bluffs that rose like ancient altars to forgotten gods. It was just before dawn when I found the cave. It wasn't marked on any of our maps, this gaping mouth in the base of a massive bluff, but something about it drew me forward with irresistible force. Maybe it was the warm air flowing from its depths, carrying scents of wood smoke and cooked meat that made my empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. Maybe it was the faint sound of voices echoing from within. Human voices, speaking in normal tones about normal things. I stumbled toward the entrance, relief flooding through me. Other people, campers, maybe, or park rangers conducting some kind of search. They would help me find David and Christopher, help me understand what had happened to us. The cave entrance was larger than I'd first thought, easily 20 feet high and twice as wide. Ancient pictographs covered the limestone walls, crude drawings of humanoid figures with elongated limbs and too many joints. As I got closer, I realized the figures seemed to be dancing around something that looked disturbingly like the bone circle I'd seen in the clearing. The voices were definitely coming from deeper in the cave, along with the warm, meat-scented air. My stomach cramped again, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since yesterday evening. Whatever was cooking in there smelled incredible, rich and savory, like the best barbecue I'd ever smelled. I called out as I entered the cave, my voice echoing off the limestone walls. "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help." The voices stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my footsteps on the stone floor. But then I heard movement ahead, footsteps approaching from the depths of the cave. Relief washed over me again. Help was coming. The cave tunnel curved sharply to the left, and when I rounded the bend, I saw light ahead, the warm, flickering glow of a fire. And sitting around that fire, looking perfectly normal and unharmed, were David and Christopher. "Michael," David called out cheerfully, waving me over with a broad smile. "There you are. We were wondering where you'd gotten to." They looked completely normal now. No black eyes, no strange growths, no naked ritual dancing. They were wearing their hiking clothes and sitting casually around a small campfire, looking like nothing unusual had happened at all. Had I dreamed the whole thing? Had the stress of being lost in the dark forest caused some kind of hallucination? "I've been looking for you guys all night," I said, still feeling disoriented. "I woke up, and you were gone. Your sleeping bags were empty." Christopher laughed, a perfectly normal sound now. "We got up early to do some exploring and didn't want to wake you. Sorry if we worried you, man. We found this cave and decided to start a fire to warm up." It all sounded so reasonable, so normal. But something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly, but my instincts were screaming warnings. Maybe it was the way they were sitting. Too still, too perfectly positioned. Maybe it was how their eyes didn't quite track my movements properly. Or maybe it was the smell of the meat cooking over their fire, which was somehow both incredibly appetizing and deeply nauseating at the same time. "Where did you get the meat?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. David gestured vaguely toward the back of the cave. "Found some game back there, fresh killed. Lucky break, considering we were getting pretty hungry." That's when I noticed the bones scattered around their fire. Definitely not animal bones. The skull, partially hidden behind Christopher's backpack, was unmistakably human, its eye sockets staring accusingly at me through the flickering flames. I tried to back away slowly, but my foot kicked something that rolled across the stone floor with a wet, meaty sound. Looking down, I saw a human hand, the fingers still wearing a wedding ring that caught the firelight. "Something wrong, Michael?" Christopher asked, his voice still friendly but now carrying an undertone that made my skin crawl. When I looked up at him, his pupils seemed too large, too dark, like black pools that went down forever. I think I should head back to camp," I stammered, continuing to back toward the cave entrance. "But you just got here," David said, standing up with movements that were too smooth, too coordinated. "And we have so much food to share. Fresh meat, still warm." They were both standing now, moving to block my retreat. In the firelight, I could see that their hiking clothes were stained with something dark and wet. David's hands were coated up to the wrists in what looked like blood, and there were pieces of meat stuck between Christopher's teeth. "You look hungry, Michael," Christopher said, taking a step closer. "When was the last time you really fed? When did you last taste the rich, warm blood of the living?" My legs finally decided to work again, and I bolted for the cave entrance. Behind me, I heard that inhuman laughter again, echoing off the limestone walls like the sound of damned souls celebrating another's fall. I ran through the curved tunnel as fast as I could, expecting at any moment to feel claws digging into my back. I burst out of the cave into the gray pre-dawn light and kept running, crashing through the forest without any sense of direction. Branches whipped across my face and roots tried to trip me at every step, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The sound of pursuit echoed through the trees behind me. Not just footsteps, but the sound of something large moving through the forest, something that broke branches and sent small animals fleeing in terror. That's when I heard the howling. It started as a single voice, long, mournful, and completely unlike any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. But then other voices joined it, creating a chorus of inhuman sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The howls were filled with an aching hunger that made my bones ache in sympathy, a desperate need that had been building for centuries. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing against the base of a massive pine tree. The howling had stopped, but I could still feel eyes watching me from the darkness between the trees, waiting, planning. The sun was coming up now, painting the forest in shades of gold and crimson that should have been beautiful, but somehow looked ominous. Every shadow seemed to hide threats. Every rustling leaf sounded like whispered promises of violence. I pulled out my cell phone, hoping desperately for a signal. But the screen showed only static. Not the normal no-signal message, but actual visual static like an old television tuned to a dead channel. I tried to orient myself using the rising sun, but something was wrong with its position. According to my compass, which was spinning wildly again, the sun was rising in the west. That wasn't possible. Nothing about this place was following the rules of the normal world anymore. My water bottle was nearly empty, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday evening. The hunger was becoming a living thing inside me, gnawing at my stomach with sharp teeth. I found myself remembering the smell of the meat cooking in the cave, how rich and satisfying it had seemed. Part of me actually considered going back. That thought terrified me more than anything else that had happened. I forced myself to keep moving, following what I hoped was still the trail back toward the parking area. But the path kept changing, branching in directions that hadn't existed before, leading to clearings that contained things I tried not to look at too closely, circles of standing stones that hummed with malevolent energy, trees that grew in spirals that hurt to follow with the eye, pools of water that reflected images of places that couldn't possibly exist. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this nightmare version of the Arkansas wilderness. My watch showed different times every time I looked at it, and the sun appeared to be moving in all directions at once. That's when I saw Christopher again. He was standing in a small clearing ahead of me, perfectly still and facing away. He looked normal from behind, just a guy in hiking gear standing quietly among the trees. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe whatever had happened to them had worn off. Maybe they were back to normal. "Chris," I called out softly. He turned around slowly, and I saw that half of his face was missing. The right side of his head was just gone, revealing bone and brain tissue that glistened wetly in the dappled sunlight. But the left side was smiling, a warm, friendly expression that seemed completely unaware of the horror it was attached to. "Hey, Michael," he said in a perfectly normal voice as if nothing was wrong. "We've been looking for you. David's back at camp making lunch. Are you hungry?" I turned and ran again, this time not caring about staying on any kind of trail. I crashed through underbrush, leaped over fallen logs, and splashed through streams without slowing down. Behind me, I could hear Christopher following at a leisurely pace, calling out cheerfully about lunch and how good the fresh meat was going to taste. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of trees and rocks and impossible geometry. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the path would curve back on itself or lead to another dead end. The Arkansas wilderness had become something else entirely, a trap designed by a malevolent intelligence that fed on human despair. I don't know how long I ran before I finally found the road. It wasn't the road we'd come in on. This was older, narrower, barely more than 2 tire tracks through the dirt. But it was definitely human-made, and it had to lead somewhere. I stumbled along it, my legs barely able to support my weight anymore. The sun was setting again, or still, I couldn't tell anymore, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruise. Long shadows stretched across the road like reaching fingers, and the temperature was dropping fast. I knew I wouldn't survive another night in the open, not in my current condition. That's when I saw the lights. A house sat maybe a quarter mile ahead, warm yellow windows glowing welcomingly in the gathering darkness. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and I could see a pickup truck parked in the gravel driveway. Real people. Civilization. Help. I practically sprinted the last few hundred yards, my exhaustion forgotten in the face of salvation. The house was old but well-maintained, a traditional Arkansas farmhouse with a wide front porch and hanging flower baskets. Everything about it screamed normalcy and safety. I pounded on the front door, probably harder than was polite, but I was beyond caring about etiquette. An elderly woman answered, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and her face creased with concern when she saw my condition. "Oh my goodness, honey, you look terrible. Come in, come in. Let me get you something warm to drink." She led me into a cozy living room that could have been lifted from a Norman Rockwell painting. Handmade quilts, family photos on the mantelpiece, a wood stove crackling cheerfully in the corner. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. "My name's Martha," she said, bustling toward the kitchen. "You just sit right there and catch your breath. I'll make some coffee and call my husband in from the barn." I collapsed into an overstuffed armchair, feeling human contact and warmth for the first time in what felt like years. "Thank you," I managed to croak. "I've been lost in the forest. My friends. Something happened to my friends." Martha's expression darkened slightly as she paused in the kitchen doorway. "Lost in the Buffalo River wilderness? Oh, honey, you shouldn't have been out there, especially not this time of year." "Why? What's special about this time of year?" She glanced around nervously as if checking to make sure we weren't being overheard. "It's almost Halloween, honey. The old things get restless around Halloween. Things that should stay buried start walking around again." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of things?" Before Martha could answer, her husband came through the back door. A tall, lean man with work-calloused hands and eyes that held the same kind of knowledge I'd seen in the park ranger's face. He took one look at me and his expression grew grim. "Found another one, did you, Martha?" he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "How many does that make this month?" "This is the third one, Harold," Martha replied quietly. "The others, well, you know what happened to the others." Harold sat down across from me, studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. "Son, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw out there. And don't leave anything out, no matter how crazy it sounds." So I told them everything. The empty sleeping bags, the chanting, the cave with the human bones, the thing that looked like Christopher but wasn't. Harold and Martha listened without interruption, their expressions growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to an old gun cabinet in the corner, pulling out a shotgun and a box of shells. "The wendigo's been awakened," he said matter-of-factly, as if he was commenting on the weather. "It happens every few years when the conditions are right. People go into those woods carrying too much pain, too much emptiness, and it calls to them, offers them a way to fill the void inside. Wendigo. I'd heard the word before, in old Native American legends, but I'd never taken them seriously." Martha nodded grimly. "It's been sleeping under those mountains for longer than anyone can remember. The Cherokee knew about it, warned people to stay away from certain areas. But white folks never listened to Indian warnings. Your friends," Harold continued, loading shells into the shotgun. "They're gone, son. What's wearing their faces now? That ain't them anymore. The wendigo takes people who are already broken inside, fills them up with its hunger until there's nothing left of who they used to be." I thought about Christopher's recent divorce, how hollow and desperate he'd seemed, David's constant need to be the leader, to prove himself, my own growing dissatisfaction with my life, the feeling that I was just going through the motions day after day. We'd all been carrying wounds when we went into those woods. "What do I do?" I asked, the question barely a whisper. Harold checked the gun's action one more time, then looked me straight in the eye. "You got two choices, son. You can try to run, get as far away from Arkansas as you can manage, and hope the hunger doesn't follow you. Or you can help me finish this before it spreads." "Spreads? The wendigo doesn't just take one or two people," Martha explained, her voice tight with fear. "It keeps feeding, keeps converting more souls to serve its hunger. Your friends will go back to civilization soon, looking perfectly normal. But they'll start killing, start feeding, start converting others. It grows like a cancer until whole communities are consumed. The thought of David and Christopher returning to Little Rock, going back to their jobs and families while carrying that monstrous hunger inside them, made my blood run cold. How many people would they kill before anyone realized what was happening? What would I have to do? I asked. Harold smiled grimly. The wendigo is old and powerful, but it's got weaknesses. Iron hurts it, blessed silver kills it, and fire cleanses the corruption it leaves behind. But first, we got to find its lair, the place where it's been sleeping all these years. I think I know where that is, I said, remembering the cave with its ancient pictographs and the warm, meat-scented air flowing from its depths. We spent the rest of the evening preparing. Harold had a surprising collection of weapons and protective charms. Old silver bullets blessed by a Cherokee medicine man, iron stakes that had been soaking in holy water for decades, bottles of kerosene, and a flamethrower that he claimed was for clearing brush. Martha packed food and medical supplies, along with several small bags of what she called protective herbs. My great-grandmother was Cherokee, she explained when she saw my questioning look. Passed down some of the old knowledge. Not much, but enough to keep us safe from things like this. We set out before dawn, driving Harold's pickup as far as the Forest Service roads would allow, then hiking the rest of the way. Harold moved through the wilderness with the confidence of someone who'd been born to it, finding paths that I couldn't even see, and avoiding areas that he claimed were corrupted. It took us most of the day to reach the cave, and by the time we arrived, the sun was setting behind the western peaks. The entrance looked different in daylight, smaller, less imposing, but the air flowing from its depths still carried that same nauseating mixture of wood smoke and rotting meat. "This is it," Harold said, studying the ancient pictographs carved into the limestone. "These drawings, they're not Cherokee, much older. Whatever drew those pictures was here when the continent was young." We spent an hour preparing, setting up defensive positions and escape routes. Harold had brought motion-activated floodlights powered by small batteries, creating a perimeter of illumination around the cave entrance. Martha arranged her protective herbs in careful patterns while I loaded the flamethrower's fuel tank. "Remember," Harold warned as we prepared to enter the cave, "whatever you see in there, whatever it shows you, it's not real. The wendigo feeds on guilt and despair. It'll try to break your spirit before it breaks your body." The cave was deeper than I'd realized during my first panicked visit. The tunnel system stretched back into the mountain for what felt like miles, branching into dozens of smaller passages. Harold led the way with his shotgun ready, while I followed with the flamethrower, and Martha brought up the rear with a bag full of silver bullets and iron stakes. The walls were covered with more pictographs as we went deeper, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They seemed to tell a story of something ancient and hungry rising from the earth to feed on human souls. The deeper we went, the more disturbing the images became, showing humanoid figures being torn apart and consumed by something with too many teeth and not enough skin. That's when we started hearing the voices. They were coming from somewhere ahead in the darkness. My friends' voices, calling my name, begging for help. But Harold had warned me about this. The wendigo was trying to lure us deeper into its domain, using our emotional connections against us. "Michael, please help us," came David's voice, echoing off the limestone walls. "It's got us trapped. We're hurt and scared, and we need you." I gritted my teeth and kept walking, but it was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run toward those voices to help my friends. But I knew now that whatever was making those sounds wasn't David and Christopher anymore. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, and what I saw there nearly broke my sanity. The cavern was enormous, easily the size of a football stadium, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above our heads. Ancient stalactites hung down like stone teeth, and the walls were covered in carvings that seemed to move and shift in the light from our flashlights. But it was the contents of the chamber that made me want to scream. Hundreds of human bones littered the floor, skulls and ribs and femurs arranged in complex patterns that hurt to look at. Some of the bones were ancient, yellowed with age and worn smooth by centuries. Others were fresh, still carrying scraps of meat and clothing. And in the center of it all, growing from the living rock like some obscene tree, was the wendigo itself. It was larger than I'd imagined, easily 15 feet tall and vaguely humanoid in shape. But the resemblance to humanity ended there. Its skin was the color of old bone, stretched tight over a frame that seemed to have too many joints and not enough flesh. Its arms were too long, ending in clawed hands that could have torn through steel. And its head was the worst part. The wendigo's skull was elongated, more like a deer's than a human's, but filled with rows of sharp teeth that seemed to go back forever into its throat. Its eyes were solid black orbs that reflected no light, and when it turned to look at us, I felt my sanity sliding toward the edge of a very deep cliff. Hanging from the creature's branches, for lack of a better word, were dozens of cocoons made from some kind of organic webbing. And inside those cocoons, I could see human shapes moving weakly, still alive but trapped in some kind of suspended state. "Dear God," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. The wendigo's head swiveled toward us with reptilian smoothness, and when it spoke, its voice was like wind through a graveyard. "Welcome," it said, and the words seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I have been expecting you, the hunter, the wise woman, and the lost soul. You have come to feed my children." That's when I saw David and Christopher. They were standing on either side of the wendigo like guards or priests, but they'd changed even more since I'd seen them in the cave. Their skin had taken on that same bone-white color, and their limbs had elongated in ways that human anatomy couldn't support. When they smiled at me, their mouths split open much too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Michael," the thing that had been David said, its voice a grotesque parody of my friend's, "you look so tired, so hungry. Let us feed you. Let us fill the emptiness inside." The wendigo began to move then, its massive form shifting and flowing like liquid nightmare. But Harold was ready. He raised his shotgun and fired, the silver-loaded shell catching the creature in what would have been its chest. The wendigo shrieked, a sound like breaking glass mixed with dying screams, and black ichor sprayed from the wound. "Now!" Harold shouted. "Hit it with everything we've got!" I squeezed the flamethrower's trigger, sending a stream of burning kerosene across the creature's lower body. The wendigo's shrieks doubled in volume as the flames caught hold, spreading across its bone-white skin like napalm. The smell was indescribable. Burning meat mixed with something chemical and wrong. Martha was throwing her protective herbs and chanting in a language I didn't recognize, creating a barrier of force that kept the creature's converted servants at bay. The things that had been David and Christopher were trying to reach us, but they seemed unable to cross the invisible boundary she'd created. But the wendigo was far from finished. It lashed out with one massive arm, claws raking across Harold's chest and sending him flying into the cavern wall. I heard bones break and saw blood spray across the ancient stone carvings. "Harold," Martha screamed, but she couldn't break her concentration without dropping the protective barrier. The wendigo turned its attention to me, those black eyes boring into my soul like hot coals. "You carry such pain," it whispered, its voice now coming from inside my own head. "Such loneliness, such desperate hunger for meaning. I can fill that void. I can make you whole." Images flooded my mind, visions of power and purpose, of never being hungry or lonely or afraid again. All I had to do was stop fighting, stop resisting, and let the hunger inside me grow until it consumed everything else. The wendigo showed me what I could become: strong, eternal, free from all the petty concerns of human existence. For a moment, I actually considered it. The flame of the flamethrower wavered as my finger loosened on the trigger. What was I fighting for, anyway? A life of meaningless routine, of empty relationships and unfulfilled dreams. The wendigo was offering me something more, something that would make all the pain and uncertainty go away forever. Then I saw Harold trying to pull himself upright, blood running down his face but his eyes still full of determination. I saw Martha maintaining her protective barrier despite the obvious strain it was causing her. These people were risking their lives to stop something they'd never even seen before, simply because it was the right thing to do. And I remembered Christopher's words about how the wilderness could heal a man's soul, how his father had taught him that it reminded you what really mattered. What mattered wasn't power or freedom from pain. It was the connections we made with other people, the choice to keep fighting even when everything seemed hopeless. I tightened my grip on the flamethrower and sent another stream of fire into the wendigo's face. The creature reared back, its shrieks now containing notes of genuine fear. The flames were spreading across its entire body, and the black ichor was flowing more freely from Harold's silver-blessed wounds. Martha's herbs were working too. I could see the protective barrier expanding, forcing the converted servants further back into the darkness. But the wendigo had one last card to play. The organic cocoons hanging from its branches began to split open, and the people trapped inside started to wake up. Dozens of missing hikers and campers, all transformed into pale, hungry things with too many teeth and not enough humanity left in their eyes. They came at us from all directions, moving with inhuman speed and coordination. "The stakes!" Harold gasped from where he'd fallen. "Use the iron stakes!" I dropped the flamethrower and grabbed the bag of blessed iron stakes, using them like spears to drive back the attacking converts. Each one I hit dissolved into black smoke and screaming wind, but there were so many of them that I couldn't possibly stop them all. That's when Martha made her choice. She dropped the protective barrier and pulled out a small bottle filled with what looked like liquid silver. "Cherokee blessed water," she said grimly. "My great-grandmother's last gift." She threw the bottle at the wendigo's base where it shattered against the stone floor. The effect was immediate and devastating. Silver light exploded outward in all directions, washing over the entire cavern like a cleansing wave. Every converted soul caught in that light simply evaporated, their stolen forms unable to exist in the presence of such concentrated purity. The wendigo itself let out a final, earth-shaking scream as the silver light consumed it from the bottom up. Its bone-white flesh began to crack and crumble, black ichor pouring from every fissure. The ancient creature that had fed on human suffering for millennia was finally dying, but its death throes brought the entire cavern down around us. Stalactites crashed to the floor like stone spears, and massive chunks of limestone began falling from the ceiling. The pictographs on the walls cracked and split, their ancient warnings becoming meaningless as the thing they'd warned about was finally destroyed. "Run!" Harold shouted, somehow finding the strength to stand despite his injuries. We stumbled toward the tunnel entrance as the mountain collapsed behind us, the wendigo's final screams echoing through stone corridors that had stood since before human civilization began. The tunnel was filling with dust and debris, and I could feel the mountain settling as the creature's unnatural presence was finally purged from its depths. We made it out just as the cave entrance collapsed completely, sealing the wendigo's tomb forever beneath tons of Arkansas limestone. The three of us lay gasping in the forest clearing as the sun rose over the Ozark Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and hope. Harold's injuries were serious but not life-threatening, and Martha's Cherokee herbs worked better than any modern medicine at cleaning and binding his wounds. We hiked back to their truck in companionable silence, all of us too exhausted and traumatized to talk about what we'd just experienced. It wasn't until we reached the main road that I finally asked the question that had been burning in my mind. How many people know about things like this? How many other monsters are out there? Harold was quiet for a long moment as he drove. Then he glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes holding that same deep knowledge I'd seen in the park ranger. "More than you might think, son. Less than there used to be. The world's changing, becoming smaller and more connected, but there are still wild places where old things sleep and sometimes they wake up hungry. What do I do now? I asked. How do I go back to my normal life after this? Martha turned around in the passenger seat, her weathered face kind but serious. You don't, honey. Not really. Once you've seen the darkness that hides behind the world, you can't unsee it, but you can choose what to do with that knowledge. They dropped me off at the visitor center where my car was still parked, looking pitifully normal and mundane after everything I'd been through. Earl the park ranger was there, and when he saw me, his expression shifted from relief to grim understanding. You made it out, he said simply, and from the look in your eyes, I'm guessing Harold and Martha had to get involved. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Earl studied my face for a moment, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a business card. If you decide you want to help, he said, there are others like Harold and Martha, people who know about the things that hide in the wild places. We could use someone with your experience. I took the card without looking at it and walked to my car. The drive back to Little Rock passed in a blur of autumn scenery and normal, mundane traffic. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing everything through different eyes now, noticing shadows that seemed too deep, sounds that didn't quite belong, people whose eyes held just a little too much hunger. That was 3 weeks ago. I've tried to go back to my normal life, but Harold was right. Once you've seen the darkness, you can't unsee it. My job feels meaningless now, pushing numbers around spreadsheets while knowing that real monsters exist in the wild places of the world. I've started having dreams about the wendigo's voice, whispering about the emptiness inside me, offering to fill it with something darker and more satisfying than human concerns. I pulled out Earl's business card yesterday. It lists a phone number and an address in Eureka Springs, along with a simple message. For those who have seen the truth. I think I'm going to call them tomorrow, because the world needs people who are willing to stand guard against the darkness, even if it means giving up the comfortable illusion of normalcy. And maybe, in fighting those monsters, I'll find the meaning and purpose that was missing from my life all along. But sometimes late at night when the wind is howling through the trees outside my apartment, I wonder if the wendigo's hunger really died in that cavern, or if some small part of it followed me home, waiting patiently for me to feed it just once, just to see what it feels like to be truly full. Two, my name is Kevin King, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Buffalo National River area in Newton County, Arkansas, near a place locals call Echoing Hollow, a name that should have been warning enough. Brandon Edwards had been my best friend since college, and when he suggested we take a week-long camping trip to disconnect from the digital world, I thought it sounded perfect. Both of us worked soul-crushing office jobs in Little Rock, and the idea of hiking through the Ozark Mountains seemed like exactly what we needed. Brandon had discovered this supposedly pristine area through some obscure hiking forum, a place where you won't see another human soul for miles. The drive took us 3 hours from Little Rock, winding through increasingly remote mountain roads until we reached what barely qualified as a trailhead, just a dirt pull-off beside a rusted Forest Service sign that read Buffalo Point Trail, 12 miles. The paint was so faded and weather-beaten that I had to squint to make out the letters. "This is it?" I asked, shouldering my pack and looking around at the dense forest that seemed to press in on all sides. Brandon grinned, his enthusiasm undimmed by the desolate surroundings. "Trust me, man. According to the forum, there's this incredible clearing about 8 miles in where hardly anyone ever camps. It's supposed to have this natural acoustics thing. Sounds echo in weird ways because of the rock formations." The first few hours of hiking were pleasant enough. The trail was well marked, winding through thick stands of oak and hickory. Brandon chatted constantly about work gossip and his latest dating disasters, his voice echoing off the limestone bluffs that rose around us. I found myself relaxing for the first time in months, the steady rhythm of our boots on the packed earth almost meditative. But as afternoon wore into evening, something began to feel off. The trail markers became less frequent, and when we did spot one, the numbers seemed wrong, like we'd somehow skipped mile marker 4 entirely. Brandon insisted we were still on track, consulting his GPS every few minutes with increasing frustration. "Stupid thing keeps losing signal," he muttered, holding his phone up toward the canopy. "Shows us going in circles." By the time we reached what Brandon claimed was our campsite, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees. The clearing was larger than I'd expected, roughly circular and surrounded by towering limestone formations that created natural walls on 3 sides. The acoustics were immediately noticeable. Every sound we made seemed to bounce and return slightly distorted, like an audio delay effect. "See," Brandon said, clapping his hands. The sound returned as an oddly hollow echo several seconds later. "Told you this place was special." Special wasn't the word I would have chosen. There was something unsettling about the way sounds lingered here, the way our voices seemed to hang in the air just a beat too long. But Brandon was already setting up his tent with characteristic efficiency, so I pushed down my unease and focused on making camp. The first night passed without incident, though I slept poorly. Every small sound, a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified by the strange acoustics of the place. I kept hearing what sounded like whispered conversations, but when I sat up to listen more carefully, there was only the natural symphony of the night forest. The second day, we decided to explore the area. Brandon had brought his camera and was obsessed with getting the perfect shot of the limestone formations. We hiked for hours, following game trails that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. It was during one of these photo sessions that I first noticed the trees. They were oaks, ancient and massive, but their bark was wrong. Instead of the rough, furrowed texture you'd expect, these trees had bark that was smooth and gray, almost skin-like. When I pointed this out to Brandon, he just shrugged. "Probably some local species," he said, not looking up from his camera. "Arkansas has weird geology. Makes sense the trees would be different too." But it wasn't just different. It was wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. The bark seemed to pulse slightly, as if something was moving beneath it, and the trees themselves were arranged in perfect circles around small clearings, too precise to be natural. That afternoon, Brandon went to gather firewood while I set up our dinner prep. He'd been gone maybe 20 minutes when I heard him calling my name from somewhere in the forest. His voice had that strange echo quality, bouncing off the limestone walls and returning from multiple directions. Kevin, come here. You have to see this," I called back, asking where he was, but got no response. Just that hollow echo of my own voice returning distorted and somehow mocking. I waited another 10 minutes before concern overrode caution, and I headed into the woods in the direction I thought his voice had come from. I found him about a quarter-mile from camp, standing perfectly still in one of those circular clearings I'd noticed earlier. His back was to me, and he didn't respond when I called his name. As I got closer, I could see he was staring at something on the ground, a pile of what looked like animal bones arranged in a complex pattern. "Brandon," I said, reaching out to touch his shoulder. He turned around, and for just a moment his face was completely blank. Not confused or surprised, just empty, like someone had turned off a light behind his eyes. Then he blinked, and his normal expression returned. "Oh, hey," he said casually. "Look at this weird bone thing. Think it's some kind of Native American artifact?" The bones were definitely arranged deliberately, spirals within spirals, forming a pattern that hurt to look at directly. They were bleached white and old, but there was no moss or vegetation growing around them, as if the earth itself rejected their presence. "We should head back," I said, feeling suddenly exposed in the circular clearing. "It's getting dark." Brandon nodded, but as we walked back to camp, I noticed he kept looking over his shoulder at the bone formation, and when he thought I wasn't watching, his expression went blank again, that same empty, switched-off look. Dinner was quiet. Brandon seemed distracted, staring into the fire with unusual intensity. When I tried to make conversation, his responses were delayed and oddly formal. The flames dance in patterns," he said suddenly, apropos of nothing. "Do you see the patterns, Kevin?" I looked at the fire. It was just a normal campfire, burning normally. "What patterns?" "The ones that show you things," he said, still staring. "The ones that tell you secrets." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Brandon, are you feeling okay? You're talking weird." He turned to look at me then, and his smile was wrong. Too wide, held too long, like someone had told him what a smile was supposed to look like but had never seen one. "I feel perfect," he said. "Better than I've ever felt. The hollow tells me things now." I suggested we get some sleep, hoping that whatever weirdness had affected him would pass by morning. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, I could hear him moving around outside the tent. Not the normal sounds of someone banking a fire or organizing gear, but a strange, shuffling, circular movement that went on for hours. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the bone pattern in the clearing. In the dream, it was much larger, covering the entire forest floor, and I was walking along the spirals like a labyrinth. At the center, something was waiting for me, something that looked like Brandon but wasn't, something wearing his face like an ill-fitting mask. I woke before dawn to find Brandon's tent empty. His sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, laid out neatly as if he'd never slept in it. His boots were gone, but all his other gear remained. No note, no sign of struggle. He'd simply vanished. I spent the next hour calling his name, my voice echoing back from the limestone walls in increasingly distorted variations. Some of the echoes sounded almost like responses, like someone was mimicking my voice just slightly wrong. I tried his cell phone, but there was no signal this deep in the mountains. As panic began to set in, I made the decision to hike back to the trailhead and get help. But when I tried to retrace our route, nothing looked familiar. The trail markers were gone, or had changed, or maybe had never existed at all. My GPS showed nothing but static, and my compass spun wildly no matter which direction I faced. It was like the forest had shifted in the night, rearranging itself into a completely different configuration. Trees I remembered passing were gone, replaced by those strange, smooth-barked oaks arranged in their perfect circles. And everywhere I went, I could hear that hollow echo. Not quite natural sounds, not quite voices, but something in between. I was near panic when I heard Brandon calling my name again. His voice came from deeper in the forest, the same odd echo making it impossible to pinpoint his location. "Kevin, I found something amazing. Come see." Relief flooded through me. He was alive, probably just got turned around in the dark. I followed his voice, crashing through underbrush and around limestone outcroppings. The calling continued, always just out of sight, always leading me deeper into the increasingly alien landscape. I found him in another circular clearing, this one larger than the first. He was standing in the center, surrounded by dozens of those bone formations arranged in concentric circles. But something was wrong with his posture. Too straight, too still, like a mannequin posed to look human. "Brandon," I called out, running toward him. "Jesus, man, I thought something happened to you." He turned to face me, and I stumbled to a stop. It was Brandon, same face, same clothes, same everything. But his movements were too smooth, too precise, and his eyes, while the right color and shape, seemed to be looking through me rather than at me. "I found the center," he said, his voice carrying that strange echo even though we were face to face. "The hollow showed me where the patterns lead." "What are you talking about? We need to get out of here. I can't find the trail, and—" "The trail doesn't exist anymore," he interrupted. "This place changes things, changes people, makes them better." As he spoke, I noticed that his shadow was wrong. The sun was directly overhead, but his shadow stretched in multiple directions, forming one of those spiral patterns in the dirt around his feet. "Brandon, you're scaring me. We need to leave. Now." He tilted his head, still smiling that too wide smile. "But why would we leave paradise? This place gives you everything you need. All you have to do is let it in." That's when I saw them. Dozens of other shadows moving through the trees around the clearing. Human-shaped but wrong, like dark reflections of people who weren't there. They were all moving in the same pattern, that slow, circular shuffle I'd heard Brandon doing the night before. "You feel it, don't you?" Brandon said, taking a step closer. "The pull. The hollow wants to show you things. Wonderful things." I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay away from me. You're not Brandon. What did you do with him?" The thing wearing my friend's face laughed, and the sound echoed off the limestone walls, multiplying until it became a chorus of identical laughs. "I am Brandon. I'm just better now. And you can be better too. All you have to do is listen." The shadows were getting closer, emerging from the trees with that same unnaturally smooth movement. I could see faces now, or the suggestion of faces, features that shifted and blurred like reflections in disturbed water. Some of them looked familiar, like hikers I might have passed on other trails, other trips, people who had found this place and been changed by it. "The hollow collects," not Brandon said conversationally. "It's been collecting for a very long time. Native tribes knew about it, stayed away. But sometimes people wander in anyway. Sometimes they hear the call and can't resist." I turned to run, but the clearing had changed. Where there had been one exit, now there were dozens. Identical gaps between the limestone formations, each one leading into darkness. The bone formations were moving too, shifting and reconfiguring themselves into new patterns that seemed to pull at my vision, demanding attention. "You can't leave," not Brandon said, his voice coming from everywhere at once now. "The hollow won't let you. It needs you. It's been so hungry." One of the shadows reached out to touch me, and where its fingers brushed my arm, my skin went numb. I could feel something trying to push its way inside, like ice-cold fingers probing at the edges of my consciousness. I broke and ran, choosing an exit at random and plunging into the dark forest beyond. Behind me, I could hear the hollow echo of multiple voices calling my name, some sounding like Brandon, others like people I'd never met. The sound chased me through the trees, seeming to come from ahead and behind simultaneously. The forest was a nightmare now. Trees that bent and swayed without wind, shadows that moved independently of their sources, and everywhere that smooth gray bark that pulsed like living skin. I stumbled over roots that felt too much like grasping fingers and ducked under branches that seemed to reach for me with deliberate intent. I ran for what felt like hours, my breath coming in ragged gasps until I finally collapsed beside a small stream. The water looked normal, reflected the sky normally, and for a moment I thought I might have escaped whatever had claimed that clearing. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Brandon approaching through the trees, walking with his normal gait, looking completely like himself again. No hollow eyes, no wrong smile, just my best friend, looking concerned and slightly out of breath. "Kevin, thank God I found you," he said, rushing over to kneel beside me. "I've been looking everywhere. I got turned around last night and couldn't find my way back to camp." Relief flooded through me so intensely I almost cried. "Brandon, is it really you?" "Of course it's me," he said, helping me to my feet. "Who else would it be? Come on, I found our camp. We need to get our gear and get out of here. This place is seriously messing with my head." I studied his face carefully. His eyes were clear and focused, meeting mine directly. His movements were natural, unconscious. Even his voice sounded right. No strange echoes, no formal cadence. This was the Brandon I knew. "I had the weirdest experiences," I said as we walked. "I could have sworn I saw you earlier, but you were different, wrong somehow." Brandon nodded seriously. "I think this place messes with your perception. All those echoes, the weird acoustics, probably causes hallucinations. I've been seeing things too." We reached our campsite, and everything was exactly as I'd left it. my pack, our cooking gear, the cold remains of last night's fire. It all looked normal and real and reassuring. "Let's pack up quick and get out of here," Brandon said, moving toward his tent. "I don't want to spend another night in this place." I was stuffing my sleeping bag when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. Brandon's tent was still empty, sleeping bag still unzipped from the inside, exactly as I'd found it that morning. But Brandon was right there, talking normally, packing his gear. Slowly, I turned to look at him. He was methodically rolling up his sleeping bag, the sleeping bag that should have been in his empty tent. "Brandon," I said carefully, "where did you sleep last night?" He looked up, and for just a moment, his face went completely blank again. Then he smiled. "In my tent, of course. Same as always." "But your tent was empty when I checked this morning." The smile never wavered. "You must have been confused. The hollow plays tricks." I backed away slowly, my hand closing around the handle of my hiking knife. "What did you do with Brandon?" "I am Brandon," it said, still packing gear with mechanical precision. "I'm your best friend. We came here together. We're going to leave together." "No," I said, pulling out the knife. "Brandon would remember that we've been best friends since college, not just that we came here together. Brandon would know that his tent was empty. Brandon would know about the bone formations." The thing stopped packing and looked at me with those hollow eyes. When it spoke, its voice had that echo quality again, that sense of coming from somewhere far away. "The hollow showed me who you really are," it said. "Showed me all your secrets, like how you've been in love with Jessica from accounting for 2 years, but never had the courage to ask her out. Like how you still sleep with a nightlight because you're afraid of the dark. Like how you blame yourself for your father's death because you didn't visit him in the hospital that last week." I felt the blood drain from my face. These were things I'd never told anyone, secrets I barely admitted to myself. "The hollow knows everything," Not Brandon continued, standing up slowly. "It knows that you're weak. It knows that you're afraid. It knows that you'll never be brave enough to save yourself." "Shut up," I whispered, but the knife was shaking in my hand. "It knows that you won't use that knife," it said, taking a step closer. "Because even though you know I'm not Brandon, I still look like him. And you could never hurt your best friend." It was right, and we both knew it. Even knowing what it was, I couldn't make myself strike at Brandon's face, Brandon's body. The resemblance was too perfect, too complete. "But I can hurt you," it said, and lunged. I threw myself sideways, rolling away from its grasping hands. Where it touched the ground, the grass withered and died, leaving brown patches in the shape of handprints. I ran again, crashing through the forest with no plan except to get away. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running, just walking at that steady, mechanical pace, knowing that I couldn't run forever. The trees were changing around me, becoming more of those smooth-barked monstrosities arranged in perfect patterns. The ground was soft and spongy, like walking on flesh, and with each step I could hear a wet, squelching sound that made my stomach turn. I burst into another clearing, or maybe the same clearing, it was impossible to tell, and found myself facing a wall of limestone that rose straight up for hundreds of feet. I was trapped. The thing wearing Brandon's face emerged from the trees, no longer bothering to walk normally. It moved with that smooth, gliding motion, its feet barely touching the ground. "The hollow has been patient," it said, "but patience has limits. It's time to choose. Join willingly and keep your consciousness. Resist and become just another echo." "What are you?" I gasped, pressing my back against the stone wall. "We are what remains," it said. "What the hollow makes of those who stumble into its embrace. Your friend fought at first, but in the end, he welcomed the change. He begged for it." "You're lying." "Am I?" It tilted its head, and for a moment Brandon's real voice seemed to break through. "Kevin, help me. It's in my head, and I can't get it out. I can feel myself disappearing piece by piece. Please, just run." Then the hollow voice returned, "But he can't run forever, and neither can you." The shadows were gathering again, those dark reflections of people who had been absorbed by this place. I could see them more clearly now. Faces I recognized from missing person reports over the years, hikers who had vanished in these mountains and never been found. I thought about Jessica from accounting, about the nightlight I still used, about all the ways I'd failed to live the life I wanted. Maybe the thing was right. Maybe I was too weak to save myself. Then I thought about the real Brandon, my friend who had terrible taste in movies but always let me pick what we watched, who had driven 4 hours to help me move apartments, who had been genuinely excited about this stupid camping trip because he thought it would be good for me. The rage that flooded through me was pure and clean and absolutely focused. "No," I said, raising the knife. "Brandon was worth 10 of whatever you are." The thing laughed. Touching, but ultimately irrelevant. It reached for me and I struck. The blade went deep into its chest and for a moment, its face was Brandon's again. Really Brandon's. Eyes wide with pain and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Then it screamed. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard, a hollow, echoing shriek that seemed to tear the air itself. The other shadows writhed and twisted, some of them dissolving entirely. The smooth-barked trees shuddered and began to crack, revealing the normal oak bark underneath. The thing staggered backward, black ichor pouring from the wound. As it fell, its form began to change, becoming something that had never been human, a twisted amalgamation of shadow and bone and hungry emptiness that hurt to look at directly. "You cannot escape," it hissed with its dying breath. "The hollow is eternal. Others will come. Others will feed it." Then it was gone, leaving only a stain on the ground that looked like old blood. The forest around me shuddered and began to change back. The limestone walls crumbled, revealing normal trees and normal sky. The bone formations dissolved into ordinary fallen branches. Even the strange acoustics faded, leaving only the natural sounds of the wilderness. I found the real trail marker about 50 yards away, partially hidden by undergrowth but definitely there. My GPS started working again, showing a clear path back to the parking area. It was like the whole nightmare had never happened. But when I got back to my tent to pack up, I found Brandon's body. He was lying peacefully in his sleeping bag, eyes closed as if he were just sleeping. But his skin was gray and cold, and when I checked for a pulse, there was nothing. He'd been dead for hours, probably since the night he'd gone missing. The coroner later said it was a heart attack, probably brought on by some kind of allergic reaction to local plant toxins. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of anything supernatural, just a tragic accident in the wilderness. I never told anyone what really happened. Who would believe me? A friend dies of natural causes on a camping trip, and I concoct some elaborate story about evil spirits and possession. They'd think the trauma had driven me insane. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the hollow. I think about all the missing persons reports from that area over the years, about the native tribes who knew to stay away, about the thing that wore my friend's face and spoke with his voice. And I think about what it said with its dying breath. Others will come. I've made it my mission to monitor the hiking forums, to watch for posts about that area. Whenever someone mentions Echoing Hollow or describes the strange acoustics of the limestone formations, I try to warn them. Most ignore me, dismissing my warnings as the paranoid rantings of someone who's spent too much time in the wilderness. But a few listen. A few change their plans. And every year, there are fewer missing persons reports from Newton County. It's not much, but it's something. A small way to honor Brandon's memory, to make sure that what happened to him doesn't happen to others. Because the hollow may be eternal, but so is the human capacity to protect each other from the dark. I keep a picture of Brandon on my desk at work. The real Brandon, smiling and laughing during better times. Sometimes Jessica from accounting asks about it, and I tell her about my friend who loved terrible movies and spontaneous road trips and believed that everyone deserved to see beautiful places. I don't tell her about the other Brandon, the one that wore his face and spoke his words but wasn't him at all. That Brandon stays buried in my nightmares, along with the memory of that hollow, echoing scream. Some secrets are too dark to share, but some warnings are too important to keep to yourself. If you ever hear about a place called Echoing Hollow in the Arkansas mountains, if someone tells you about limestone formations with strange acoustic properties, if you see posts on hiking forums describing bone patterns in circular clearings, please, for the love of God, stay away. Some places are hungry, and some hungers can never be satisfied. Trust me on this one. I learned it the hard way. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Buffalo National River in Arkansas, where the Ozark Mountains stretch endlessly into darkness, and the trees seem to whisper secrets that no human should ever hear. It was supposed to be a simple team-building retreat. Our marketing firm had been hemorrhaging clients, and our boss thought a weekend camping trip would help us reconnect as colleagues and rediscover our collaborative spirit. Corporate bullshit, but we all needed the paid time off. Me, Jennifer Williams, no relation despite the shared surname, Robert Johnson, and Sarah Rodriguez. 4 office drones trading fluorescent lights for firelight, if only for 3 days. We'd driven out Friday evening in my pickup truck, winding through increasingly narrow roads until we reached a remote camping area that Robert had discovered on some obscure hiking forum. Totally off the grid, he'd promised, grinning with that boyish enthusiasm that made him popular with clients. No cell towers, no ranger stations, just pure wilderness. The spot was beautiful, I'll give him that. A clearing surrounded by towering oaks and pines, with a small creek running along the eastern edge. The nearest road was a good mile through thick forest, and according to Robert's research, we wouldn't see another soul for the entire weekend. Perfect for team bonding. Perfect for other things too, as it turned out. Jennifer had been unusually quiet during the drive, staring out the window with a distant expression. She was our graphic designer, normally sharp-tongued and quick with sarcastic observations, but lately she'd seemed elsewhere. Sarah noticed it too. "You okay, Jen? You've been weird all week." "Just tired," Jennifer replied, but her voice carried an odd flatness that made my skin crawl. "Haven't been sleeping well." We set up camp as the sun began to sink behind the tree line, our 4 tents arranged in a rough square around the fire pit Robert had built. The silence was immediate and oppressive. No highway noise, no aircraft, no signs of civilization. Just the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of water flowing over stones. "God, listen to that quiet," Sarah said, stretching her arms above her head. She was our account manager, a small woman with fierce energy who could charm the most difficult clients. "When's the last time any of us heard actual silence?" "Never," Robert laughed, striking a match to light our kindling. "I've lived in cities my whole life. This is—" He paused, listening to something I couldn't hear. "This is different." The fire caught quickly, sending orange light dancing across our faces. We cooked hot dogs and beans, sharing stories and jokes as the darkness crept closer. But something felt wrong from the beginning. Little things. Jennifer kept staring into the tree line with that same distant expression. Our phones had died simultaneously despite being fully charged when we arrived. And the sounds, or lack of them. No insects, no birds. Just the crackling fire and our own voices echoing strangely in the stillness. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" I asked around 9 o'clock. "Like, really quiet?" "Woods get quiet at night," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Probably just the time of year." "It's June," Sarah pointed out. "Should be buzzing with mosquitoes and crickets." She swatted at the air experimentally. "Haven't seen a single bug since we got here." Jennifer stood abruptly, her movements jerky and unnatural. "I'm going to get more firewood." "I'll come with you," I offered, but she was already walking toward the tree line. "No," she said without turning around. "I want to be alone for a minute." We watched her disappear into the darkness beyond our fire's reach. The beam of her flashlight bobbed between the trees for a few moments, then vanished entirely. "She's been acting strange," Sarah whispered. "Like, really strange. Yesterday, she just stood in the break room for 10 minutes, staring at the wall. When I asked if she was okay, she looked at me like she didn't recognize me." "Stress," Robert said, poking the fire with a stick. "This job's been killing all of us." But I was remembering other things. How Jennifer had been arriving at work exactly at 8 a.m. for the past week, when she was usually 10 minutes late. How she'd stopped joining us for lunch, preferring to sit alone in her cubicle. How her laugh had sounded wrong. Too high. Too long. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. "She should be back by now," I said, standing up. "Firewood doesn't take this long." "Maybe she went to the creek," Sarah suggested, but her voice was tight with worry. We called Jennifer's name, our voices swallowed by the oppressive darkness. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and started toward the trees where she'd disappeared. "We should stick together," Robert said, and for the first time that night he sounded genuinely frightened. We found her about 100 yards into the woods, standing perfectly still beside a massive oak tree. Her back was to us, her flashlight lying at her feet, its beam cutting uselessly across the forest floor. "Jen," Sarah called softly, "what are you doing?" Jennifer turned around slowly, too slowly, like a rusty door on ancient hinges. In the harsh white light of our flashlights, her face looked wrong. Her eyes were too wide, unblinking, and her mouth was stretched in a smile that went on forever. "I found something," she said, and her voice was Jennifer's voice, but also not Jennifer's voice. "Something interesting." "What did you find?" Robert asked, but I was already backing away. Every instinct I possessed was screaming that this wasn't Jennifer. "Not anymore." She tilted her head at an impossible angle, still wearing that terrible smile. "Firewood." There was no firewood around her, just leaves and darkness and that oak tree, which seemed to loom larger in our flashlight beams than it had any right to. "Jennifer, you're scaring us," Sarah said. "Let's go back to camp." "Yes," the thing wearing Jennifer's face agreed. "Let's go back to camp." We walked back in single file, Jennifer leading the way with that same unnatural smile. She moved differently now, her gait too fluid, her feet making no sound on the leaf-strewn ground. Behind her, Sarah grabbed my arm with trembling fingers. "That's not her," she whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear. "That's not Jennifer." But what choice did we have? We couldn't leave her in the woods, and we couldn't explain what we'd seen. Maybe stress really was making us paranoid. Maybe the isolation was getting to us faster than we'd thought. Back at the fire, Jennifer sat down in exactly the same spot she'd occupied before, but she faced outward toward the darkness instead of inward toward the warmth. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She just smiled that endless smile and watched the tree line with eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's. "I think we should go home," Sarah said. "First thing in the morning." "Come on," Robert protested, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We just got here. It's probably just—" "Look at her, Robert," I interrupted. "Really look at her." He did, and I watched the color drain from his face. Jennifer hadn't moved a muscle in the past 10 minutes. Hadn't blinked, hadn't shifted position, hadn't even seemed to breathe. But the worst part was her expression. That unwavering smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Jennifer?" Robert called softly. She turned her head toward him with mechanical precision. "Yes, Robert? Are you feeling all right?" "I feel wonderful," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "I feel more myself than I've ever felt." That's when I noticed her fingernails. They were longer than they'd been an hour ago, and they came to sharp points. As I watched, one of them scraped against the log she was sitting on, leaving deep gouges in the wood. "We're leaving," I said, standing up. "Right now." "No," Jennifer said, and now her smile showed too many teeth. "We're staying. We're all staying." "The hell we are." I kicked dirt over the fire, sending sparks flying into the darkness. "Pack up. We're going back to the truck." That's when Jennifer laughed, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. In the dying firelight, her face seemed to shift and blur, features rearranging themselves into something that might have been human, but definitely wasn't. "You can't leave," she said, rising to her feet with movements that were too smooth, too fast. "None of you can leave." We ran. I don't remember making the conscious decision to run, but suddenly we were crashing through the underbrush, our flashlights cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Behind us, Jennifer's laughter followed like a physical thing, pressing against our backs and tangling around our legs. "The truck!" Robert gasped. "Get to the truck!" But the forest had changed. Paths that should have led back to the road instead wound deeper into the wilderness. Trees that I swore hadn't been there before now blocked our way, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. And underneath it all, we could hear Jennifer, or whatever was wearing Jennifer's face, calling our names in a voice that grew less human with each repetition. Michael, Sarah, Robert. The words echoed from multiple directions as if she was everywhere and nowhere at once. "Come back to camp. Come back and play." We stumbled through the darkness for what felt like hours, our flashlights growing dimmer as the batteries drained. The creek that should have led us back to civilization seemed to be flowing uphill now, its water black as oil under our fading lights. "This isn't possible," Sarah sobbed. "The road was right there. It was right fucking there." "Stay calm," I said, but my own voice was cracking. "We just got turned around. We'll find it." Robert had stopped moving entirely, standing frozen in the middle of a small clearing. "Guys," he whispered, "listen." The forest had gone completely silent again. No rustling leaves, no flowing water, no sound of our own ragged breathing. Even our heartbeats seemed muffled, as if the darkness itself was absorbing every vibration. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from every direction at once. Michael, Sarah, Robert. The voice was closer now, and wrong in ways that made my teeth ache. It still sounded like Jennifer, but with undertones of wind through empty spaces and the creak of old bones. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly motionless in the dying beam of my flashlight. But this wasn't the Jennifer we'd found by the oak tree. This version was taller, thinner, with arms that hung too long at her sides. Her face was still recognizably Jennifer's, but stretched, as if someone had taken a photograph and pulled it at the corners. "Found you," she said, and took a step forward. Sarah screamed. The thing wearing Jennifer's face moved toward us with impossible speed, crossing the clearing in 3 fluid strides. Up close, I could see that her skin was mottled and gray, like old meat, and her eyes were completely black. When she smiled, her teeth were sharp as needles and went back much too far. "Don't run," she said, reaching toward Sarah with fingers that had become claws. "Running spoils the meat." I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at her head. The wood passed through her as if she was made of smoke, and she laughed again, the sound of breaking glass and dying things. "Stupid Michael," she said, tilting her head at that impossible angle. "I'm not really here. Not the way you think." "Then what are you?" Robert demanded, his voice high with terror. The thing that looked like Jennifer considered this question, still wearing that terrible smile. "I'm what Jennifer is becoming, what you're all becoming. This place, it changes people, makes them into something better." As she spoke, her form began to shift and blur. One moment she looked like Jennifer, the next like something that might have been human once, long ago. Her skin rippled like water, showing glimpses of fur and scales and things that had no name. "Where is she?" Sarah sobbed. "Where's the real Jennifer?" "I am the real Jennifer," the creature replied. "More real than she ever was. And soon, you'll be real too." That's when I noticed Sarah's fingernails. They were getting longer. "Sarah," I whispered, backing away from her, "look at your hands." She looked down and screamed again, but this time the sound was wrong, too high with harmonics that hurt to hear. Her fingernails were indeed growing longer, curving into claws even as we watched. Her teeth were changing too, becoming pointed and sharp. "It's starting," the Jennifer thing said with satisfaction. "The change always starts with the extremities, then the voice, then the mind." "No," Sarah gasped, staring at her transforming hands. "No, no, no." But her voice was already different, carrying those same impossible harmonics. And her eyes. God, her eyes were starting to turn black. Robert grabbed my arm. "We have to go. Now." We left Sarah there in the clearing, changing into something that wasn't human anymore. I can still hear her screaming our names as we crashed through the underbrush, her voice becoming less recognizable with each cry. We ran for hours, or maybe minutes. Time seemed to have no meaning in that place. The trees moved when we weren't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations. Our flashlights died one by one, leaving us stumbling through absolute darkness guided only by desperate hope. When we finally collapsed from exhaustion, Robert was breathing hard beside me. Too hard. Each exhale carried a wheeze that sounded almost like laughter. "Robert," I whispered. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was changing too. Just tired. So tired. I fumbled for my dead flashlight, clicking it desperately until it produced one final fading beam. In that weak light, I saw Robert's face, and my blood turned to ice. His features were shifting, blurring, rearranging themselves into something that might have been human but definitely wasn't. His eyes were starting to turn black, and when he smiled at me, his teeth were sharp as broken glass. "Don't worry, Michael," he said in a voice that was becoming less his own with each word. "It doesn't hurt, not after the first few minutes." I ran again, leaving Robert behind just like we'd left Sarah. But now I was alone in the darkness, and I could hear them calling my name from multiple directions. Jennifer's voice, Sarah's voice, Robert's voice, all wrong, all changed, all hungry. "Michael, come back, Michael. We're waiting for you." I stumbled through the forest for what felt like days, my hands bleeding from thorns and branches, my clothes torn to shreds. The darkness was absolute now, pressing against me like a physical weight, but gradually, impossibly, I began to see light ahead. Dawn was breaking through the trees, and with it came the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. The dirt road where we'd parked my truck. The vehicle sat exactly where we'd left it, covered in morning dew but otherwise untouched. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I didn't stop until I reached civilization. I didn't stop until I was surrounded by other human beings who cast normal shadows and had normal voices and normal eyes. The police didn't believe me, of course. They organized search parties, found our abandoned campsite, but no sign of Jennifer, Sarah, or Robert. The official report listed them as missing persons, presumed lost in the wilderness. There was talk of exposure, of wild animals, of the dangers of inexperienced hikers venturing into remote areas. But I knew better, because 3 days after I escaped from those woods, Jennifer Williams walked into our office building. She looked exactly as she always had. Professional clothes, perfect makeup, that slightly sarcastic smile. She nodded at the security guard, rode the elevator to our floor, and sat down at her desk as if nothing had happened. When people asked where she'd been, she just smiled and said she'd decided not to go camping after all. She'd spent the weekend at home, she claimed, catching up on Netflix and doing laundry. But I could see the truth. Her eyes were black as midnight when she thought no one was looking. Her fingernails were filed to points, and when she laughed at someone's joke, the sound carried harmonics that made my teeth ache. She wasn't Jennifer anymore. She was something wearing Jennifer's face, playing Jennifer's role, waiting. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've moved to another city, taken a job with a different company. I tell myself I'm safe now, surrounded by concrete and steel and the comfortable noise of urban life. But sometimes, late at night, I hear them calling my name. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I notice that my fingernails are growing longer. The change always starts with the extremities, she'd said. Then the voice, then the mind. I can feel it beginning. Just this morning, I caught myself standing in my apartment, staring at the wall for I don't know how long. When I realized what I was doing, I tried to laugh it off, but the sound that came out of my throat was wrong, too high, with harmonics that shouldn't exist. My teeth feel sharper when I run my tongue across them. My reflection in windows sometimes shows features that aren't quite right, and every night the voices in my dreams grow clearer, more insistent. "Come back, Michael," they whisper. "Come home. We're waiting for you." I'm writing this down because I can feel myself slipping away, piece by piece. Whatever that place was, whatever lived in those woods, it's not done with me. It never was. The distance doesn't matter. The change has already begun. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old, but I don't think I'll be Michael Williams much longer. Something else is waking up inside my skin, something that remembers the taste of fear and the sound of screaming in the darkness. Something that knows how to wear a human face while thinking inhuman thoughts. I've started looking at my neighbors differently, wondering how they would sound when they scream. I've started imagining what they would taste like. These aren't my thoughts. They can't be my thoughts, but they feel so familiar, like memories of a life I've always lived. The thing wearing Jennifer's face was right about one thing. It doesn't hurt after the first few minutes. The pain is fading now, replaced by a hunger that grows stronger every day. A hunger for warm flesh and terrified eyes and the sweet music of breaking bones. I should fight it. I should resist. But God help me, I don't want to anymore. The change is almost complete, and when it's finished, I'll go back to those woods. I'll join Jennifer and Sarah and Robert in the darkness between the trees, and we'll wait for the next group of lost souls to stumble into our domain. We'll be so happy to see them. So very, very happy. My name is Kevin King, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas, near the Buffalo National River, 3 months ago. Brian Wright and I had been planning this hiking trip for weeks. We both worked dead-end jobs at the same insurance firm in Little Rock, spending our days trapped under fluorescent lights, drowning in paperwork and conference calls. The idea of escaping into the Arkansas wilderness for a long weekend felt like salvation. Brian, my closest friend since college, had found what he called the perfect spot, a remote section of the Ozark National Forest near Steel Creek, where the Buffalo River carved through limestone bluffs and ancient hardwood forests stretched for miles without a single road or cell tower. "No distractions, no bullshit," Brian had said, showing me the topographical maps spread across his kitchen table. Just us, the woods, and 3 days of actual peace. I should have trusted my instincts when I felt that first chill looking at those maps. The area Brian had circled was truly isolated. Miles from the nearest ranger station, accessible only by a barely maintained logging road that dead-ended at an old steel bridge over Smith Creek. Something about the emptiness of it, all those contour lines with no names, no landmarks except the occasional stream or ridge, made my stomach tighten. But I pushed the feeling down. After all, isolation was exactly what we wanted. We left Little Rock early Friday morning in Brian's pickup truck, the bed loaded with our gear, tent, sleeping bags, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, and Brian's grandfather's old hunting rifle. The drive took us deeper and deeper into the Arkansas backcountry, past tiny towns with names like Rush and Ponca, until we were winding through narrow mountain roads carved into limestone cliffs. The trees grew denser as we climbed, their canopy so thick it blocked out most of the October sunlight. The logging road was worse than the maps had indicated. Brian's truck bounced and scraped over ruts deep enough to swallow a tire, branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. After an hour of crawling forward at 5 miles per hour, we finally reached the steel bridge over Smith Creek. The structure looked like it hadn't been maintained since the 1960s. Rust-eaten beams and warped planking that groaned ominously under the truck's weight. "Jesus, Brian," I muttered as we crossed. "Are you sure about this place?" "Trust me," he replied, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "The solitude will be worth it." We parked at the trailhead, really just a break in the tree line marked by a faded Forest Service sign so weathered I couldn't read the text. The silence hit us immediately after Brian killed the engine. No traffic, no machinery, no human sounds at all. Just the whisper of wind through autumn leaves and the distant murmur of Smith Creek below. Loading our backpacks, we started up the trail. It was barely visible, just a deer path winding through stands of oak, hickory, and pine that hadn't been touched by logging. The forest felt old here, primordial. Trees with trunks wider than I could wrap my arms around towered overhead, their branches intertwining to form a canopy so dense that even in early afternoon, the woods were dim and green-tinted. For the first few hours, hiking felt therapeutic. The rhythm of walking, the clean smell of pine needles and damp earth, the way our breathing synchronized as we climbed ridge after ridge. It was exactly what I'd needed. Brian was in his element, pointing out animal tracks, identifying bird calls, navigating by compass and topographical map like some kind of wilderness scout. But as the afternoon wore on, I started noticing things that didn't feel right. Small things at first. The way our voices seemed to get swallowed by the trees, never echoing the way they should. How we hadn't seen or heard a single bird or squirrel in over an hour, despite the forest looking healthy and alive. The peculiar stillness of the air, as if the woods were holding their breath. Around 4 o'clock, we stopped for water near a small clearing where Smith Creek curved close to the trail. The creek looked wrong. Too dark, too still, with an oily sheen on the surface that shouldn't have been there. Brian knelt to filter water for our bottles, but when he stood up, he was frowning. "That's weird," he said, showing me the filter. It was already black with sediment, though the water had looked clear. "Must be tannic acid from dead leaves upstream." I nodded, but something cold was crawling up my spine. The water smelled wrong, too. Not like decay or pollution, but like metal, like old blood. We hiked another hour before Brian called a halt in a small clearing surrounded by massive pine trees. "This is perfect," he announced, dropping his pack. "Sheltered, flat ground, and look at this view." Through a gap in the trees, we could see across a deep valley to the limestone bluffs on the far side, their gray faces catching the last rays of sunlight. It should have been beautiful, but the shadows between the trees seemed too dark, too deep. And the silence was absolute now. Not even the sound of our own creek anymore. Setting up camp took longer than expected. My tent stakes kept hitting rocks or roots just below the surface, forcing me to move the tent twice. Brian's camp stove wouldn't light properly, the flame guttering and turning strange colors, blue, then green, then a sick yellow that made my eyes water. When it finally caught, the flame burned normally, but Brian kept staring at it with a puzzled expression. "Probably just the altitude," he said, though we were only at about 1,200 feet. As darkness fell, the wrongness became impossible to ignore. The temperature should have dropped gradually, but instead it plummeted all at once, like someone had opened a freezer door. Our campfire, which had been burning strong, suddenly began to struggle, the flames dancing erratically despite the still air. Worse, the shadows cast by the firelight seemed to move independently, flickering and shifting in ways that didn't match the motion of the flames. "Kevin," Brian said quietly around 8 o'clock, "do you hear that?" I listened, straining my ears. At first, nothing. Then, just at the edge of perception, a sound like breathing. Slow, rhythmic, coming from the darkness beyond our firelight. But it was too deep, too measured to be human breathing. and it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. "Probably just wind through the trees," I said, but my voice came out hoarse. Brian was studying his GPS device, tapping the screen with increasing frustration. "This thing is going crazy. It keeps showing our location jumping around, sometimes by miles." I checked my phone. No signal, which was expected, but the battery was draining impossibly fast despite being fully charged that morning. As I watched, it dropped from 63% to 58% in the span of 30 seconds. "Brian, I think we should—" The breathing sound stopped. Completely. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. Even the crackling of our fire seemed muted. That's when we heard the voice. It came from the darkness beyond the pine trees, a low whisper that somehow carried clearly across the clearing. "Help. Me." Brian was on his feet instantly, grabbing a flashlight. "Someone's out there." I caught his arm. "Don't. Kevin, someone might be hurt." The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, help me." It was thin, desperate, but there was something wrong with the cadence. The words came too slowly, with too much space between them. "Hello?" Brian called out. "Where are you? Are you injured?" Silence. Then, from a completely different direction. "Help. Me. Please." The hair on my neck stood up. No one could have moved that far that quietly. "That's not a person," I whispered. Brian looked at me like I was crazy. "Of course it's a person. Someone's lost out there." "Brian, think about it. How could they have moved from there to there without making any noise? And that voice, help. Me." The voice was definitely closer now, maybe 30 feet away, just beyond the reach of our firelight. But now I could hear something else underneath it. A low, guttural sound, like an animal trying to mimic human speech. Brian clicked on his flashlight and swept the beam toward the voice. The light caught something pale moving between the trees, a flash of what might have been skin or clothing. Then nothing. "I'm going to check it out," Brian said, starting toward the tree line. "No." I grabbed his arm again, harder this time. "Something's wrong here, Brian. Really wrong. The water, the fire, the sounds. None of this is normal." For a moment he looked uncertain. Then the voice came again, right at the edge of the clearing now. "Please, I'm hurt. Need help?" Brian shook off my grip. "I can't just ignore someone who needs help." He walked toward the voice, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I watched him reach the tree line, then pause. "Hello," he called. "I'm here to help. Where are you?" That's when I realized the voice had stopped responding as soon as Brian got close. It was like whatever was making the sound was now just waiting. "Brian, come back," I said, but my voice cracked. He turned toward me, and in the flashlight's backglow I could see confusion on his face. "There's nobody here, but I could have sworn." He swept the light around the trees. "These tracks, though, look at this." Even from 20 feet away, I could see what had caught his attention. There were marks in the soft earth between the pine trees, but they weren't human footprints. They were too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. "Those are just animal tracks," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Brian knelt for a closer look. "These are big, really big, and look at the stride length." He played his light along the trail of marks. Whatever made these was walking on two legs. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in an instant, and our fire guttered so low I thought it might go out entirely. In the sudden dimness, the shadows between the trees seemed to shift and writhe. "Brian, get back here, now." He started back toward the fire, but halfway across the clearing he stopped dead. His flashlight beam was pointing at something just beyond our camp, and even in the erratic firelight I could see his face go white. "Kevin," he whispered, "look at our tent." I turned and felt my stomach drop. Our tent was still there, but it was wrong. The fabric was shredded from top to bottom, long tears that looked like claw marks. Our sleeping bags were pulled out and scattered around the clearing, and our food bag, which we'd hung carefully from a high branch, was on the ground, torn open, contents strewn everywhere. That was fine 10 minutes ago, Brian said, his voice barely audible. We'd both been watching the clearing. Nothing could have done that damage without us seeing it. I grabbed the rifle from where Brian had propped it against a tree. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the bolt action. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now." "Kevin, it's pitch black out there. We can't navigate these trails in the dark. We can't stay here." As if summoned by my words, the breathing sound started again. But now it was coming from directly overhead. Both of us looked up at the same time. Something was moving in the pine branches 30 feet above us. Something big enough to bend the thick boughs. In the dancing firelight, I caught glimpses of pale skin, impossibly long limbs, and what might have been a face, but stretched and distorted beyond human proportions. "Jesus Christ," Brian breathed. The thing dropped. Not fell. Dropped deliberately, landing in a crouch at the very edge of our firelight. For a split second, I saw it clearly. Humanoid but wrong, stretched vertically like a person reflected in a funhouse mirror. Its skin was the color of old bone, pulled tight over a frame that was simultaneously skeletal and muscular. The face was the worst part. Human features but elongated, with black eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's. Then it spoke, and the voice was exactly what we'd been hearing. "Help. Me." The words came from a mouth that was too wide, filled with teeth that were too sharp. I raised the rifle, but my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't aim. The thing tilted its head with predatory curiosity, then grinned, the expression of such malevolent intelligence that my bladder nearly let go. Brian grabbed a burning branch from the fire and waved it at the creature. "Stay back." The thing laughed. Thing. The sound was like breaking glass mixed with a death rattle. Then it moved. I've never seen anything move that fast. One moment it was crouched at the edge of the clearing, the next it was behind Brian, those impossible long arms wrapping around his chest. Brian screamed and swung the burning branch backward, but the creature caught his wrist and squeezed. I heard bones crack and the branch fell from his nerveless fingers. I finally managed to pull the trigger. The rifle shot boomed through the forest and the creature shrieked, a sound that made my ears ring and my vision blur. It released Brian and melted back into the darkness beyond the firelight. Brian collapsed to his knees, clutching his broken wrist. What was that thing? I don't know. I was cycling the bolt action, chambering another round. But we're getting out of here. We gathered what we could by firelight, the flashlights, first aid kit, what remained of our water. Everything else was ruined or scattered. Brian's wrist was definitely broken, already swelling and turning purple, but he could still walk. "Which way?" he asked, looking around the clearing. That's when I realized we had a problem. In our panic, we'd lost track of which direction led back to the trail. The clearing was surrounded by identical-looking pine trees, and in the darkness, everything looked the same. I pulled out my compass, but the needle was spinning wildly, never settling on a direction. The trail was that way, I think. I pointed toward what felt like the right direction. "Are you sure?" "No." We started walking anyway. Behind us, I could hear something moving parallel to our course, keeping pace but staying just beyond the reach of our flashlights. Occasionally, we'd catch a glimpse of pale skin between the trees, or hear that awful, not quite human breathing. The forest seemed different now, alien. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks looked wrong, as if someone had moved them while we weren't looking. The trail we'd followed earlier was nowhere to be found, and after an hour of stumbling through underbrush and over fallen logs, I was completely lost. "Kevin," Brian said, his voice tight with pain. "I need to rest." We stopped in a small clearing, backs against a large oak tree. I kept the rifle ready while Brian tried to fashion a sling for his broken wrist using his torn shirt. That's when I heard it. the sound of our camp stove igniting. It was coming from back the way we'd come, the familiar whiff of gas-catching flame. Then I smelled it, the unmistakable aroma of our dehydrated camping food being prepared. "Something's at our campsite," I whispered. "Cooking our food," Brian added, his voice hollow. We sat in silence, listening to the normal sounds of someone making dinner in the wilderness. The casual domesticity of it was somehow more terrifying than the creature's alien presence had been. 20 minutes later, the sounds stopped. Then I heard whistling. The tune was "Take Me Home, Country Roads," the same song Brian had been humming while we'd set up camp earlier, but the whistling was coming from the wrong direction, off to our right instead of behind us. "That's not possible," Brian breathed. The whistling moved, circling our position. Sometimes it sounded close, sometimes distant, but it never stopped. Whoever, or whatever, was making the sound was moving through the forest without making any other noise, no footsteps or rustling leaves. Then I heard my own voice. "Brian, I think we should head back. This place is giving me the creeps." The words were exactly what I'd said earlier in the day, when we'd first reached the creek, but now they were coming from the darkness ahead of us, spoken in my own voice with perfect inflection. "Brian, I think we should head back. This place is giving me the creeps." Again, but from a different direction. "Brian, I think we should head back. This place is giving me the creeps." And again. Soon, my voice was echoing from all around us, the same sentence repeated over and over like a broken record. Brian was pressed against the tree trunk beside me, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "It's trying to confuse us," I said. "Make us think we're going crazy." "Are we?" Brian asked. "Going crazy?" I didn't have an answer for that. The voices stopped abruptly, leaving us in absolute silence again. Then, from very close by, I heard Brian speak. "Kevin, I'm going to go get some more firewood. I'll be right back." But Brian was sitting right next to me. I turned to look at him, and his face was a mask of terror. His lips weren't moving, but his voice continued. "Kevin, I'm going to go get some more firewood. I'll be right back." The voice was coming from about 30 feet away, in the direction we'd been heading. "That's not me," Brian whispered. "I know." We heard footsteps then, the sound of someone walking through dry leaves, normal human footsteps heading away from us. "Should we follow?" Brian asked. "God, no." But after a few minutes of silence, curiosity got the better of me. I crept forward, rifle ready, until I could see into the next clearing. There was a figure there, kneeling by a pile of deadfall branches. In the moonlight, it looked exactly like Brian. Same height, same build, same clothes. But when it turned toward me, the face was wrong. The features were Brian's, but the proportions were off, like a photograph that had been stretched, and the eyes were solid black. The thing that looked like Brian smiled at me with too many teeth. "Found some good wood," it said in Brian's voice. "Help me carry it back." I backpedaled quickly to where the real Brian was waiting. "What did you see?" he asked. "You, but not you. We need to move, now." We started walking again, this time in the opposite direction from the fake Brian. But after a few hundred yards, we heard footsteps following us. And more of those terrible conversations. Our own voices having discussions we'd never had, saying things we'd never said. The worst part was that some of the conversations sounded so normal, so mundane, that for a moment I'd find myself believing they were real memories. The creature, or creatures, I was no longer sure if there was just one, had somehow absorbed not just our voices but our speech patterns, our mannerisms, even our vocabulary. Dawn was still hours away, and I was beginning to think we weren't going to make it. That's when Brian stumbled and fell. His broken wrist hit the ground and he cried out in pain. When I helped him up, I could see exhaustion and fever in his eyes. "I can't keep going like this," he said. "I need to rest." "We can't stop. Not out here. Just for a few minutes. Please." Against my better judgment, I let him sit down against another tree. While he caught his breath, I kept watch, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. That's when I saw the light. At first, I thought it was another flashlight, but the glow was wrong. Too steady, too blue-white. It was moving through the trees about 100 yards away, bobbing slightly as if someone was walking. "Brian," I whispered. "Look." He followed my gaze and saw it too. "Another hiker? Out here? At 3 in the morning?" We watched the light move through the forest. It was definitely following a path of some kind, moving with purpose rather than wandering randomly, and it was heading in our general direction. "Hello," Brian called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Over here, we need help." The light stopped moving. "We're lost," Brian continued. "My friend is injured." The light started moving again, but now it was coming straight toward us, and it was moving faster. "Brian, I don't think—" "Thank God," he said, getting to his feet. "Finally, someone who can help us get out of here." The light was close enough now that I could see it was indeed a flashlight, carried by a human figure. As it approached, I could make out more details. A middle-aged man in hiking clothes carrying a large backpack. He looked completely normal, which somehow made me more nervous. "Are you boys all right?" the man called out, his voice friendly and concerned. "I heard shouting." "My friend broke his wrist," Brian said, "and we're completely lost. Can you help us get back to the trail?" The man stepped into our small clearing and his flashlight illuminated his face. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Everything about him radiated trustworthy competence. "Of course I can help," he said. "I'm a volunteer search and rescue coordinator for this district. Name's Harold Kessler." He set down his pack and pulled out a first aid kit. "Let me take a look at that wrist." While Harold examined Brian's injury, I studied the man more carefully. His gear was top quality, well maintained. His movements were those of someone comfortable in the wilderness. Everything about him suggested he was exactly who he claimed to be. So why did I feel like something was horribly wrong? "Definitely broken," Harold said, wrapping Brian's wrist with an elastic bandage. "But it's a clean break. You'll be fine once we get you to a hospital." "How far are we from the parking area?" I asked. Harold consulted a GPS device. "About 3 miles. Not bad. We can be back to your vehicle in a couple of hours." 3 miles. We'd been walking in circles for most of the night, but we'd only moved 3 miles from our starting point. "Lead the way," Brian said gratefully. Harold shouldered his pack and started walking. His pace was steady but not too fast, and he seemed to know exactly where he was going. After 20 minutes, we reached a well-maintained trail that I didn't recognize. "This connects to the main trail system," Harold explained. "Much easier walking from here." As we hiked, Harold kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking about our jobs, our families, our hiking experience. Normal small talk that should have been reassuring, but I noticed that he never quite answered direct questions about himself, always deflecting with another question. And there was something about his voice. It was friendly, warm, completely human. Too human. Like someone doing an impression of what a helpful person should sound like. After an hour of walking, Brian was lagging behind, favoring his injured wrist and breathing heavily. Harold called for a rest stop near a small stream. "You're doing great," he told Brian. "We're more than halfway there." Brian nodded gratefully and sat down on a fallen log. Harold offered him water from his own bottle, which Brian accepted eagerly. That's when I saw it. In the pre-dawn gloom, Harold's shadow was wrong. The shadow cast by his flashlight was too long, too thin, with appendages that didn't match his arms and legs. And when he moved, the shadow moved a split second too late, like it was copying his movements rather than being caused by them. I stepped closer to get a better look, and Harold turned toward me. In the brief moment before he could control his expression, I saw something else looking out through his eyes. Something ancient and hungry. "Everything all right, Kevin?" he asked, and his voice was still perfectly normal. "Fine," I said, but I was already backing away. "Just stretching my legs." Harold smiled and turned back to Brian, who was drinking deeply from the offered water bottle. "That should help with the dehydration," Harold said. "We'll have you out of here in no time." Brian lowered the bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Thanks, I feel much—" He stopped mid-sentence, his expression going blank. The bottle slipped from his fingers and hit the ground with a hollow thunk. "Brian," I said. He turned to look at me, and I saw that his eyes were now completely black, just like the creature we'd encountered at our campsite. "I feel much better now," Brian said, but it wasn't Brian's voice anymore. It was Harold's voice coming out of Brian's mouth. Harold laughed, and now he wasn't bothering to maintain his human appearance. His flesh was rippling, stretching, revealing the same pale, elongated form we'd seen before. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" the thing asked, speaking with Harold's voice while wearing Harold's rapidly melting face. "Did you think you could just walk away?" Brian, or the thing wearing Brian's body, stood up and started walking toward me. His movements were wrong, too fluid, like a marionette being manipulated by an expert puppeteer. I raised the rifle, but my hands were shaking again. Which one should I shoot? The thing that looked like Harold, or the thing that looked like my best friend? "You can't kill us, Kevin," Harold Thing said. "We're part of this place now, part of the forest. And soon, you will be too." Brian Thing was close enough to touch now. When he spoke, his voice was a horrible blend of Brian's tone and Harold's words. "It doesn't hurt, Kevin. You just stop being yourself, and then you become something so much better." I pulled the trigger. The bullet took Brian Thing in the chest, spinning him around and knocking him to the ground. Black ichor sprayed from the wound instead of blood, and the thing that had been my friend made a sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe. Harold Thing shrieked and lunged toward me, his human disguise falling away completely to reveal the pale, skeletal creature underneath. I worked the bolt action and fired again, this time catching it center mass. The impact slammed it backward into a tree, where it writhed and thrashed like a pinned insect. Both creatures were down, but not dead. The things that had been Harold and Brian were pulling themselves along the ground toward me, leaving trails of black fluid behind them. Their wounds were already beginning to close. I had 2 rounds left. I ran. The trail was clear enough to follow even in the dim, pre-dawn light, and I was running faster than I'd ever run in my life. Behind me, I could hear the creatures recovering, then the sound of pursuit. But now there were more than 2 sets of footsteps following me. Many more. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw at least 6 figures chasing me through the trees. Some looked human, others had given up the pretense entirely. All of them were gaining ground. The trail curved sharply to the left, and suddenly I could see lights ahead, the warm yellow glow of electric bulbs. A building materialized out of the forest gloom. A ranger station, blessedly normal and human. I sprinted the last 100 yards and pounded on the door with the rifle butt. "Help! Please, open up!" The door swung open to reveal a park ranger. A real one this time, I hoped. He was young, probably early 30s, with the kind of deep tan that came from spending most of your time outdoors. "Jesus, what happened to you?" he asked, taking in my torn clothes and wild expression. "There are things in the forest," I gasped. "They killed my friend. They can look like people, but they're not." "Whoa, slow down," the ranger said, putting a calming hand on my shoulder. "You're safe now. Come inside and tell me what happened." He led me into the ranger station, which was warm and bright and wonderfully normal. Coffee brewing on a hot plate, maps on the walls, a radio crackling with routine check-ins from other rangers. "My name's Tom Bradley," the ranger said, guiding me to a chair. "I'm the duty officer here. Now, what's this about your friend?" I told him everything, starting with our arrival at the campsite and ending with my escape. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or taking notes. When I finished, He was quiet for a long moment. "That's quite a story," he said finally. "You mentioned these creatures could mimic human appearance. Perfectly, at first, but there were always tells, wrong shadows, voices that didn't quite match." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "And you shot 2 of them?" "Yes, but it didn't kill them, just slowed them down." "Interesting." Tom stood up and walked to the window looking out at the forest. "Tell me, Kevin, how do you know I'm really a park ranger?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I stared at Tom's back, my mind racing. How did I know? The uniform looked right, the station looked right, but after everything I'd been through, I don't, I admitted. Tom turned around and he was smiling, but it was the same too wide smile I'd seen on the creature at our campsite. "Very good," he said. "You're learning." I started to raise the rifle, but Tom was already moving. He crossed the room in 2 impossibly long strides and grabbed the barrel, twisting it out of my hands with casual strength. Now, he said in a voice that was no longer quite human. "No need for that. You've caused quite enough trouble already." His face was changing, features flowing like melted wax. The ranger uniform split and fell away as his body stretched and elongated. "Did you really think you could escape us by running to the authorities?" the thing asked. "We are the authorities here. We are everything here." I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The lights went out, plunging the station into darkness. In the blackness, I heard movement all around me. Multiple creatures, circling. "There is no escape, Kevin," Tom's voice said from the darkness. "There never was. This forest is our domain, and you are trespassing." A hand, or something like a hand, grabbed my shoulder. Then another took my arm. I struggled, but there were too many of them, and they were impossibly strong. "Don't fight," one of them said in Brian's voice. "Soon you'll understand. Soon you'll be one of us." They dragged me toward what I hoped was the back of the ranger station. I could smell fresh air, pine needles, the forest. But as we moved, the smell changed, becoming something else. Old meat, decay, the musty odor of something that had been buried too long. We were no longer in the ranger station. We were underground in some kind of cave or tunnel system. The walls were smooth, organic, like the inside of a throat, and they were warm. They dropped me in a circular chamber lit by a phosphorescent glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Around the perimeter of the room, I could see other figures, dozens of them, all standing perfectly still with their eyes closed. Some looked like hikers who had gotten lost over the years. Others wore the uniforms of park rangers, search and rescue volunteers, even a few that looked like local law enforcement. All of them had that same pale, waxy skin tone, and all of them were breathing in perfect unison. "Welcome to the collection," Tom Thing said. "Every person who has wandered too deep into our territory over the past century. They're still alive, in a sense, still themselves, but also part of something larger." One of the figures opened its eyes and looked at me. It was Harold, the fake rescue coordinator, but his face was peaceful now, serene. "It's actually quite pleasant," he said in a voice like rustling leaves. "You stop worrying about things like mortality, identity, the separation between self and other. You become part of the forest itself." "What are you?" I asked. "We are what remains," Tom Thing replied. "When the last of the old people left these mountains, when the sacred places were forgotten, we were still here, hungry, waiting." The pale figures began to move, forming a circle around me. Their eyes were all open now, all black, all focused on me with predatory patience. "The transformation is painless," Brian's voice said from somewhere in the crowd. "You just let go." They were closing in now, reaching for me with hands that ended in claws. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. This was it. That's when I remembered the emergency flare in my jacket pocket. I'd forgotten about it completely. A road flare that Brian had insisted we carry in case we needed to signal for help. My fingers found it, pulled it free, struck the ignition cap. The flare burst into brilliant red light and the creatures shrieked in unison, covering their eyes and stumbling backward. The phosphorescent glow of the chamber walls flickered and dimmed. "Fire," I realized. "You're afraid of fire." I held the flare high and started moving toward what I hoped was an exit. The creatures followed but kept their distance, hissing and snarling just beyond the circle of red light. The tunnel sloped upward, and after what felt like hours of climbing, I saw stars overhead. I was in a natural sinkhole, maybe 50 feet across, with limestone walls rising on all sides. The tunnel I'd emerged from was just one of many openings in the walls, a honeycomb of passages that probably extended for miles underground. Climbing out was easier than I'd expected. The limestone was rough with plenty of handholds, and fear gave me strength I didn't know I had. When I finally hauled myself over the rim, I was in a familiar clearing. It was our original campsite. Our tent was still there, still shredded. Our scattered gear lay exactly where we'd left it. But now I could see the truth. The clearing was directly over the sinkhole. We'd been camping on top of their lair the entire time. The flare was burning lower now, maybe 10 minutes of light left. I gathered what I could from our scattered supplies, Brian's truck keys, a water bottle, the first aid kit, and started running. The logging road was easier to find in daylight. I reached Brian's truck just as the flare finally died, and for a terrifying moment I thought the engine wouldn't start. But it turned over on the third try, and I was speeding down that rutted road as fast as I dared. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, and I didn't feel safe until I was back in Little Rock, surrounded by traffic and streetlights and the comfortable noise of civilization. The police were understanding, but skeptical. A missing hiker, yes, they'd start a search immediately. But my story about underground creatures and possessed rangers, they suggested I see a doctor, get checked for dehydration and possible hallucinations. The search teams found our campsite 3 days later. They found Brian's blood, real blood this time, and signs of a struggle. But they never found Brian's body, and they never found any trace of the creatures or the underground chamber. The official report listed Brian Wright as missing, presumed dead due to animal attack or accidental injury. The case remains open, but I know they've stopped actively investigating. I quit my job and moved to Phoenix. I tell people I needed a change of scenery, which is true enough. What I don't tell them is that I can't sleep without all the lights on, that I wake up screaming from dreams of pale things with too many teeth, or that I've never been able to enter a forest since that weekend. Sometimes, late at night, I'll get phone calls from unknown numbers. When I answer, there's just breathing on the other end, slow, measured, too deep to be human. And sometimes, very faintly, I can hear Brian's voice in the background calling for help. The calls always come from Arkansas area codes. I've thought about going back, about trying to find that sinkhole again and maybe rescue whoever might still be down there, but I know the truth. There's no rescue possible. Whatever those things are, they've been in those mountains far longer than humans have walked upright. They're patient, and they're hungry, and they're very good at waiting. So I stay in the desert now, surrounded by concrete and steel and electric lights. I tell myself I'm safe here, that those things can't reach me in the city. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can smell pine needles and damp earth. And I remember that forests aren't the only places where old things can hide and wait and hunger. They could be anywhere. They could be anyone. And late at night, when I'm lying awake listening for sounds that shouldn't be there, I wonder if the thing that calls itself Kevin King is really me at all, or just another puppet in their collection, sent out into the world to find new prey for the darkness between the trees.